Section 1. The Nuclear Contamination Theory. There is a town in America that does not appear on any map. It has a nuclear power plant that has racked up 342 safety violations and never been shut down. It has a river where the fish grow a third eye. It has a billionaire employer who has been running the same company for over a century and glows faintly in the dark after his weekly medical treatments. It has a family at its center, a father, a mother, 3 children who have been living in the same house on the same street for 36 years without anyone in that house aging a single day. The town is called Springfield, and tonight we are going to spend a long time there. This is a slow video. There are no jump scares, no dramatic music stings, no shouting, just a long, careful walk through 36 seasons of buried storylines, contradictions, and fan theories so well supported by canonical evidence that the show's own writers have been forced to acknowledge them publicly. The lights are low. You can close your eyes whenever you like. The story will keep moving, and if you drift off somewhere in the middle, Springfield will still be here when you come back. It always is. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's start with the theory that, once you really sit with it, explains almost everything strange about this show in a single idea. The Springfield nuclear power plant is poisoning the entire town, slowly, quietly, and with full knowledge of the man who owns it. Now, that might sound like a dramatic opening statement, but the evidence for this theory is not hidden. The show has never hidden it. It has been laying out the case, piece by piece, episode by episode, for over 3 decades, in plain sight, in the background of jokes, in throwaway lines that nobody was meant to take seriously. The mystery is not whether the plant is poisoning Springfield. The mystery is how the show has gotten away with telling you this for so long without the audience connecting the dots. Let's start at the beginning, with what we know for certain. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the wealthiest man in Springfield and possibly the wealthiest man in the state, depending on which episode you're watching. The plant is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town. Every house, every business, every streetlight in Springfield is running on electricity generated by those 2 reactor units. The town is completely dependent on Burns's facility for the basic infrastructure of modern life. And that facility is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most dangerous industrial sites in the history of fiction. A surprise inspection, and the word surprise is doing a lot of work there, because the plant clearly was not prepared for any outside scrutiny, turned up 342 separate safety violations. Not 3, not 30. 342 documented failures of safety protocol, structural integrity, containment procedure, and basic regulatory compliance. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. Not because the money wasn't available. Burns is a billionaire many times over, and $56 million is not an amount that would meaningfully affect his lifestyle. He refused because fixing the problems would require admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would require someone to start asking what those problems had already done to the people living downwind of the facility for the past several decades. The violations themselves, when the show bothers to describe them in detail, are extraordinary. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into local waterways. Radioactive waste being left on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on a desk somewhere inside the facility. Cooling towers cracked open and patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats, rats that actually glow, rats that produce visible light from their bodies running freely through the lower levels of an active nuclear facility. And then there is the detail that the show introduces casually and never returns to. Human skeletons in the basement. Not one skeleton. Not a single unexplained set of remains. Skeletons. Plural. Human bones. In the basement of a working nuclear reactor, in a town of roughly 30,000 people, and the safety inspection notes this, and then the show moves on, and nobody in Springfield ever asks a single question about whose remains those are or how they came to be there. This is what the Springfield nuclear power plant is. This is what it has always been. And the man responsible for preventing all of it from getting worse, the man whose literal job description is to stand between the reactor core and the surrounding community and ensure that nothing catastrophically dangerous leaks out, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, whose IQ the show's own creator has stated on the record is 55. Homer Simpson, who at one point in the series was found to have a crayon physically lodged in his brain since childhood, The crayon actively reducing his cognitive function by occupying space in his frontal lobe that was supposed to be doing something else. Homer Simpson, who sleeps at his workstation, who eats donuts during active meltdown warnings, who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen to it, the curiosity of a child, the security clearance of an adult, and the consequences left entirely to everyone else. That is the person standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe, and he has been standing there failing at that job for over 30 years. Now here is where the theory gets its teeth. The first visible mutation in Springfield appears in Season 2. A fish pulled from the river near the power plant, a fish that has developed a third eye. The fish's name, as given to it by the show, is Blinky. And Blinky becomes, briefly, a national news story within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as campaign evidence that Burns is poisoning the local environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate to the public that it is perfectly safe to consume. The town watches. The town shrugs. The town moves on. Nobody conducts a follow-up study on the river. Nobody tests the water supply. Nobody asks the question that seems, from the outside looking in, to be completely obvious. If the fish in the river near the power plant have developed a third eye, what is happening to the people who have been drinking the same water? The show does not answer this question directly, but it has been answering it indirectly for years. Look at the people of Springfield. Look at them carefully, not as cartoon characters whose design is just a style choice, but as inhabitants of a universe where the show has established that radiation causes visible physical mutation. Look at Homer, the massive overbite, the bulging eyes, the skull shape that does not correspond to any human cranial anatomy, 4 fingers on each hand, which is true of every resident of Springfield and no one else in the wider world the show occasionally depicts. An IQ so suppressed it qualifies as a clinical condition, a body that absorbs physical punishment that would be fatal to any normal human being, and recovers from it with a speed that defies biology. Homer has been shot, he has been electrocuted, he has fallen from cliffs, been struck by cars, survived explosions at close range. Every one of these events would kill a person in the real world. Homer walks away from them, sometimes limping, sometimes covered in bandages, but always functional by the next scene. His pain tolerance is not human. His healing rate is not human. And he has spent his entire adult life working in direct proximity to an active reactor core. Look at Marge, the same bulging eyes, the same 4-fingered hands, hair that grows straight upward in a tower, maintaining its precise shape for decades without product, without structural support, defying the laws of physics and gravity in ways that the show treats as completely normal, because within Springfield it is completely normal. Marge was briefly employed at the power plant herself. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same leaking radiation before any of her children were born. And then the children. Bart, Lisa, Maggie. All born in Springfield, all raised in Springfield, all drinking the water, breathing the air, growing up in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers, all displaying physical characteristics that simply do not occur in uncontaminated human populations. The spiky hair that maintains itself without product, the overbites, the yellow skin. That yellow skin is the detail that makes this theory cohere most completely. The residents of Springfield are yellow, every single one of them. Not just the Simpson family. Every person who lives in Springfield has yellow skin. It is so consistent, so universal, so thoroughly woven into the visual identity of the show that audiences accept it as simply how the show looks, a style choice, an aesthetic decision made in the animation department, and that is probably how the writers thought of it too, at least at the beginning. But apply the logic of the show's own universe to the question, and something interesting emerges. When celebrities visit Springfield, when guest characters arrive from outside the town, they look different. Not in minor ways, fundamentally different. Their proportions are more natural, their eyes are more normally shaped, their features more closely approximate actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with more realistic proportions than it draws Springfield residents, and the standard explanation is that it is just the art style. That is how The Simpsons looks. But within the logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone look one way. The people outside it look another way. The people inside it are yellow, four-fingered, bulge-eyed, anatomically anomalous. The people outside it are more or less normal-looking. Even the animals are affected. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners, the same proportional deviations from actual canine anatomy. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. The wildlife of Springfield is demonstrably mutated by the power plant's runoff. The show has told you this directly, clearly, without ambiguity. It has shown you a 3-eyed fish and labeled it as evidence of what the radiation is doing to living organisms in this environment. And then it expects you to believe that the exact same radiation, leaking from the exact same facility into the exact same waterways and air supply, has had absolutely no effect on the humans who live there. Burns knows. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes, and it is worth laying out exactly how clearly it does so. Burns funds private medical research that the show only glimpses. He retains personal physicians who are not affiliated with any public medical institution. He undergoes a weekly medical treatment, the precise nature of which the show describes in terms that are deliberately vague but clearly involve significant doses of radiation and experimental pharmaceutical compounds. The treatment is so intensive, so chemically saturated, that it causes Burns's entire body to emit what the show calls a healthy green glow. After each session, Burns emerges from the facility in a dazed, disoriented, euphoric state. He wanders through the woods near Springfield, glowing visibly in the dark. This is not a metaphor. Burns is so saturated with radiation and treatment compounds that his body produces bioluminescence. He glows. And when the townspeople of Springfield encounter this glowing figure stumbling through the forest, their first instinct is not to wonder about the power plant that dominates their skyline. Their first instinct is that they have encountered an alien from another world. That is how deep the denial runs. The most obvious explanation, the one that involves the enormous nuclear facility they can see from their living room windows, does not even enter the conversation. And Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield because he has been personally managing its effects on his own body for a very long time. He knows what radiation does to biological systems because radiation is the only reason he is still alive. He has the resources, the medical infrastructure, the pharmaceutical capabilities to synthesize experimental treatments that no ordinary person in Springfield would ever have access to. He knows what his plant is doing to the town because he has been watching it happen, and he has built an entire system to ensure that his position above the contamination zone, economically and medically, remains stable. Homer's continued employment at the facility is not, under this theory, a matter of negligence or forgetfulness on Burns's part. It is strategic. When a group of German investors briefly purchased the plant, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was commission a proper assessment of the facility's condition, at which point they discovered that the cost of bringing it up to regulatory standards was so astronomical it nearly bankrupted them. Burns bought the plant back. He rehired Homer immediately. A competent safety inspector would shut that plant down within a week of thorough assessment. Homer ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over the town's power supply, its economy, and by extension, the cognitive and physical capacity of its entire population. A population that has been breathing irradiated air and drinking contaminated water long enough that their ability to recognize what is happening to them has been compromised at the neurological level. The Crayon episode, Season 12, is the piece of evidence that transforms this theory from an interesting fan reading into something that feels genuinely unsettling when you examine it closely. In that episode, Homer discovers that he once had the crayon removed and his IQ responded by jumping to genius level. Temporarily free of the physical obstruction in his frontal lobe, Homer became intelligent, articulate, capable of understanding the world around him with a clarity he had never experienced. And it made him miserable. Not because intelligence itself was painful, but because intelligence in Springfield meant seeing Springfield for what it actually was. He could look at his job and understand what the job meant. He could look at his town and understand what was happening to it. He could look at his own life with clear eyes, and what he saw was unbearable. So he had the crayon put back in? He chose the fog over the clarity? He chose not to know. But the question the show never asks is the one that matters most. How did a crayon get lodged in a child's brain in the first place, and stay there through his entire childhood and adolescence and adult life without a single medical professional in Springfield noticing it? Homer visited doctors in Springfield. He received checkups from Springfield medical professionals over decades. Not one of them found a foreign object in his skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any reasonable explanation, or the medical establishment of the town is compromised. Either they lack the equipment to find it, or they found it and chose not to remove it. And if the latter is true, then someone made a decision, at some point, that Homer Simpson was better off with the crayon in his brain. If Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of the town he essentially owns, if the doctors are looking the other way while radiation eats through their patients' neurons, then Homer's crayon is not just a medical anomaly. It is a symbol the show is using to tell you something it cannot say in plain language. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that keeps them slow, compliant, incapable of looking up at those cracked cooling towers and asking the most basic question a person can ask. Something that keeps them from wondering why their children are yellow and their fish have 3 eyes and their employer glows in the dark and remembers events from before the First World War. The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains every mystery simultaneously. The characters do not age because their mutated biology has been fundamentally altered at the cellular level. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's memory function has been compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation exposure in ways that make him nearly indestructible, while leaving him cognitively devastated. Burns stays alive through treatments that would kill a normal person because he has been managing his own radiation exposure for over a century, with resources that nobody else in town can access. And nobody in Springfield questions any of this, because the same poison that mutated their bodies also damaged the part of their brains responsible for critical thinking. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town with an eccentric population and a few running gags about nuclear power. Springfield is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, that provides their electricity, that employs their neighbors and poisons their water and irradiates their children, is not a background gag in the mise-en-scène of a sitcom. It is the cause. It has always been the cause. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery from what should be a fatal injury, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every unexplained mystery that the show introduces and never resolves. It all traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged brains that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have 4 fingers and their town has been classified as an environmental hazard by a federal agency. The plant is not part of the show. The plant is the show. It has been the show from the very beginning. And the people of Springfield will never figure that out. Because the plant already made sure they cannot. If you are watching this late at night, drop a comment with your time and where you are in the world. And if you want more long videos like this, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Now let's keep going. Number, Section 2. Homer's coma, the dream that never ended. There is a second theory that sits alongside the radiation theory, and in some ways it is even more emotionally difficult to sit with. Because where the radiation theory is about a system that broke a town from the outside, this theory is about a man who may be living entirely inside his own mind, dreaming a life he can no longer actually have. This is the Homer coma theory, and it is, by some considerable distance, the most debated, most analyzed, most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. The starting point is a specific episode, Season 4, Episode 18. It aired on the 1st of April, 1993, and it was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise of the episode is relatively simple. Bart plays a series of increasingly elaborate April Fool's pranks on Homer, escalating each time until, in the final escalation, he takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and puts it inside an industrial paint shaker. The can is shaken until the pressure inside it is extraordinary. Then it is placed back in the refrigerator for Homer to find. When Homer opens the can, the explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. This is played for laughs. The family visits Homer in his hospital bed. The episode is mostly a clip show, revisiting moments from previous seasons, and it proceeds at a leisurely pace. Then Homer sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for the machine. The machine tips forward, it falls on him, and Homer flatlines. not as a cutaway gag, not as a dream sequence. Within the actual, canonical continuity of the episode, Homer Simpson enters a clinical coma. The machines flatline. The doctors arrive, the family is gathered, Homer is unconscious, and the episode makes no attempt to soften or comedify what has happened. He is in a coma. It is real. The episode ends with Homer seemingly waking up. Bart is at his bedside, tearfully confessing that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son, and the family laughs and everything goes back to normal, and the show tells you that Homer has recovered. But in the final moments of that same episode, a doctor mentions in passing that Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%. Gone. Permanently. Destroyed. Never coming back. And Homer's response to this information, to learning that he has sustained permanent neurological damage, is to laugh. He says he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The show continues for 32 more years as if nothing happened. Unless nothing did happen, unless Homer never woke up at all. The basic premise of the Homer coma theory is this: Homer Simpson did not actually wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity guest appearance, every impossible event, every world-spanning adventure, every divine encounter, every physical impossibility, all of it is a dream. A dream being generated inside the mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield, General, slowly losing brain function, while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. The evidence is extensive, and it builds in ways that are genuinely difficult to dismiss once you start looking at them carefully. The most immediately striking thing is the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in any strict sense. It was always a cartoon, the satire was always broad, the physical comedy always exaggerated. But the storylines were built around recognizable human problems. Homer tries and fails to quit drinking. Marge begins to have serious doubts about her marriage. Lisa develops an intense, embarrassing crush on her substitute teacher. Bart faces the very real possibility of being held back a year in school. These are the emotional concerns of an actual family, filtered through a comedic lens, but rooted in the kind of anxieties and tensions and small dramas that real families navigate. The financial stress of a single-income, working-class household. The loneliness of a child who is smarter than her environment. The complicated love between a father who is not particularly equipped for fatherhood and a son who needs him to show up anyway. That is the show before April 1993. After the coma, the show becomes something else entirely, and the shift is not subtle. Homer goes to space. Not in a dream sequence, not in a Treehouse of Horror episode. In a canonical "this actually happened in the show" universe episode, Homer Simpson becomes an astronaut and travels to the International Space Station. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society with its own underground facilities and elaborate rituals. Homer discovers that his mother, who he was told had died when he was a child, is actually alive and has been living underground as a fugitive radical activist for 27 years. Homer has face-to-face conversations with God. Twice. Homer meets the President of the United States. Homer travels to dozens of countries. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs. Homer befriends an apparently endless parade of celebrities who appear in Springfield for reasons that grow less and less tethered to any grounded logic. The escalation from domestic family comedy to surreal adventure anthology is so dramatic that even viewers who are not thinking about any theories at all have noticed it. The internet has been debating when exactly The Simpsons declined, when the quality slipped, when the writing lost its grounding for 20 years. Different people draw the line at different points. But almost everyone agrees that somewhere around season 8 or 9, something fundamental changed about what the show was. The coma theory offers a precise answer. The Simpsons did not get worse. Homer's brain got worse. And the show is faithfully depicting the deteriorating dream of a man whose consciousness is slowly unwinding in a hospital bed. Dreams escalate. They begin with recognizable fragments of reality, the faces and places and relationships that are already stored in the dreamer's memory, and they gradually become stranger, more grandiose, more disconnected from the rules that govern waking life. The early post-coma episodes still feel relatively grounded because Homer's brain is still in early-stage coma, still generating relatively coherent simulations from reasonably intact memory stores. But as the coma extends, as months become years and years become decades, the brain deteriorates. The dream becomes less stable, the logic becomes less consistent, and the events become increasingly impossible and increasingly surreal. What looks like declining writing quality from the outside is, under this theory, a faithful portrait of a dying mind. And there is a detail introduced in the episodes before the coma that the coma theory transforms from a quirky theological gag into something that sounds remarkably like a prophecy. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a direct conversation with God, not a dream version of God, not a symbolic representation, an actual face-to-face conversation with the divine, in which God is a speaking character who interacts with Homer directly. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells Homer that Homer will one day know the meaning of life. But not yet. Homer's time is coming, God says, but it has not arrived yet. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline fits. God, in this reading, was not making a general theological statement about human enlightenment. God was telling Homer that his waking life was approaching its end, and that whatever comes after whatever Homer experiences on the other side of consciousness will be the moment of understanding that God was describing. The dream that follows the coma is Homer learning, for the duration of an unconscious lifetime, what his life has meant, who his family is to him, why they are worth holding on to even when everything becomes strange and impossible and untethered from reality. God told Homer his time was coming, and 6 months later Homer's conscious life ended. Everything that followed was the dream of a dying man who only wanted his family. The aging problem is the piece of this that the coma theory resolves most elegantly, and it is worth dwelling on. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. This has been true for 36 years. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle or a gray hair. The show uses what is called a floating timeline. The characters always exist in the present moment, but they never advance through it in any way that would require them to get older. Every other theory about The Simpsons attempts to explain this in various ways. The radiation theory says the mutation has altered their biology. The cartoon logic explanation says it is simply the convention of long-running animated shows. These are reasonable enough explanations for what is, at its core, a production choice. But the coma theory has a different answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never woke up. Of course, his children do not age. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not present to observe it happen. His wife does not age because the last time he saw her, before the vending machine fell, she looked exactly as she did in that hospital room. His friends do not change because his memory of them is frozen at the last moment he experienced them consciously. Homer's coma dream preserves the world exactly as it was on the day he lost it, because that is what the unconscious mind does. It works with the reference material it has. It cannot generate new data about people changing and growing because it has no access to new data about those things. The coma locks the world in place. And every episode since April 1993 is Homer's brain running a simulation of a life he is no longer living, using only what was already stored before the vending machine fell. The celebrity appearances make sense too, though in a darker way. Homer's coma brain is not entirely isolated. He is lying in a hospital room. There is a television in that room, or a radio, or visitors who speak near him, or nurses who talk to each other while checking his monitors. The sleeping mind receives ambient input and incorporates it into the dream. Homer's brain hears a name, a voice, a reference to something in the outside world, and it processes that information and weaves it into the simulation. That is why later seasons of the show are flooded with celebrity guest appearances that seem increasingly arbitrary. It is not that Springfield became a magnet for famous people. It is that Homer's brain, receiving fragments of media and conversation from the hospital room through the fog of unconsciousness, is translating those fragments into dream characters. Every celebrity who shows up in Springfield is a voice Homer heard through the haze, processed into a figure his dreaming mind can interact with. The dream is absorbing the world outside the hospital room and making it part of the story. And the story has to keep going, because if the story stops, Homer might have to wake up. The show itself has engaged with this theory directly. which is its own kind of acknowledgement. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was presented as a deliberately leaked deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma and reveals that all the outlandish episodes were a dream. The show's writers created this scene, animated it, and then presented it as a hoax, a fake deleted scene planted by hackers, not genuine content. But they made it. They wrote it, storyboarded it, animated it, and released it as a direct reference to the fan theory. The writers know about the coma theory. They have thought about it carefully enough to create a response to it, and their response was to simultaneously depict the theory being true, Homer waking up from a coma, and confirming that the outlandish episodes were dreams, and then immediately say, "That was not real. We were joking. It was hackers. They showed you the answer and told you it was a fake." Al Jean, the executive producer who has overseen the show for much of its run, addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it is not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation without grounding in the actual creative intentions of the show's writers. And he is probably right that the writers did not consciously design the post-season 4 episodes as a deteriorating coma dream. That was almost certainly not the room's intention when they were writing Homer going to space or Homer joining a secret society. But what Gene did not address, what he has never addressed, is why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show has become progressively more surreal and disconnected from grounded reality with each passing decade, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dream generated by a brain that is slowly deteriorating. He said it is not true. The interviewer moved on. But the fans did not move on because the theory does something that no official explanation has managed to accomplish. It makes the show make sense. All of it. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the increasingly impossible plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, the fact that Homer can survive anything and endure anything and recover from anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed, only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind cannot kill him because his mind is the one generating the story. Here is the part that lingers after you close the thread. If the coma theory is true, the emotional center of The Simpsons is not a comedy. It is something much quieter and much sadder than that. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind returns to episode after episode after episode for 36 years, is profoundly simple. He wants his family. That is the entire dream. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, frustrating, wonderful little boy. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone in her room. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold, still young enough to need him, still there when he comes through the front door. He wants Friday night in Springfield to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives him everything he needs. His family preserved exactly as they were. His children never growing up and away from him. His wife never leaving. His life never arriving at the moment where he has to face how much time has passed and how much he has missed. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. Under this reading, it is the only heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young and the beer in the refrigerator is always cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye. Every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets after a catastrophe, every time the credits roll and everything is back to normal, it is not lazy writing or a failure of narrative consequence. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, the dream stops. And when the dream stops, Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how many years have gone by, how old his children have grown, whether Marge was still sitting beside him at the end, whether anyone was. Or the other possibility. Waking up means not waking up at all. That is the coma theory. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April of 1993. Every episode you have ever watched since that date is a love letter written by an unconscious father to the family he cannot reach. The show will never confirm this, but it has never disproved it either, because the evidence is not hidden in some obscure corner of the show's canon. The evidence is the structure of the show itself. Nobody ages, reality keeps getting stranger, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Because in the dream, he never left. Number section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Now we are going to talk about the greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons, the one that was packaged as a solved case in September of 1995 and has quietly refused to stay solved ever since. Who shot Mr. Burns? The official answer, the one the show delivered and the writers stand behind, is Maggie Simpson. Baby Maggie, 1-year-old, pacifier in mouth. That is the answer Springfield arrived at, and for the most part, that is the answer the audience accepted and moved on from. But the evidence does not fully support that answer. And the more carefully you examine the case, the clues, the contest, the alternate endings, the follow-up confession in Season 18, the more it looks like the official verdict was the most convenient answer rather than the most accurate one. Let's go back to the beginning, because the setup matters enormously. Season 6, Episode 25. The episode aired in the spring of 1995, and it was called Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. And this was genuinely unprecedented in American animated television. A mystery. A real whodunit, designed with enough internal clues and red herrings that Fox promoted a national audience participation contest around it. Viewers were invited to submit their guesses for who pulled the trigger. The winner would be animated into an actual episode of the show. Fox promoted it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional shooting like an unsolved real crime. That summer, the question of who shot Mr. Burns was something people argued about at dinner tables and in offices and on early internet forums in ways that feel, in retrospect, like a genuine cultural moment. The setup for the mystery was meticulous. Burns had spent the first half of Season 6 systematically destroying the lives of everyone in Springfield. He drilled for oil beneath Springfield Elementary and stole the resulting revenue, gutting the school's entire budget at a stroke. He called in debts from Moe's Tavern, forcing the bar to close and Moe to declare bankruptcy. He created a geological sinkhole that swallowed the Springfield retirement castle. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in a separate incident. And for his final act, Burns constructed a massive mechanical disc, a sunblocker, literally, and positioned it in the sky over Springfield to block sunlight from reaching the town, so that every resident would be forced to buy their electricity from his plant rather than generating any of it through solar means. He stole the sun from an entire community. When Smithers, Burns's most loyal employee and devoted companion, protested this final scheme on moral grounds, Burns fired him on the spot, without hesitation, without sentiment. The one person who had dedicated his life to Burns's well-being was dismissed the moment he showed an inconvenient conscience. By the end of the episode, every single character in Springfield had a documented, legitimate grievance against Burns. The show took careful time to establish motive for Moe, for Skinner, for Willie, for Tito Puente, whose music program was cut, for Grandpa Simpson, whose retirement home was destroyed, for Homer, whose name Burns has never been able to remember, despite Homer working for him for years, which had driven Homer to a documented breaking point. The town gathered for a public meeting to confront Burns directly. Multiple characters arrived visibly armed. The tension was so thick the episode could barely contain it. Burns collapsed in front of the crowd with a single gunshot wound. He staggered to the town sundial and fell. His outstretched hands landed on two letters, W and S, from the audience's perspective, or M and S from Burns's own point of view as he lay dying. The screen went black. America waited the entire summer. When Part 2 aired in September 1995, the resolution was structured like a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum stumbled through the investigation with his characteristic incompetence. Suspects were eliminated one by one. Smithers confessed immediately, but his confession fell apart when it became clear he was blackout drunk during the shooting and had actually shot someone else entirely, old Jasper in his wooden leg, a different victim at a different location. He was innocent of the Burns shooting through the most absurd possible technicality. Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente has the most celebrated alibi in the history of television, which was a full musical number explaining that he had channeled his rage into a samba performance rather than violence, delivered with complete sincerity and great style. The investigation stalled until police found an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis confirmed the eyelash belonged to a Simpson. Homer had fingerprints on the gun. Homer had the most vocally expressed, most frequently displayed motive of anyone in town. Homer was arrested. He was about to be convicted. And then Burns woke up from his own coma and identified the shooter. Maggie Simpson. He encountered her in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Baby did it. Except let us look at the contest first, because what happened with the contest is important. Fox had invited viewers across America to submit their guesses, and the prize was substantial, being animated into a future episode. Thousands of entries came in. According to the DVD commentary for these episodes, recorded by the writers themselves, not a single entry from the randomly selected sample pool guessed the correct answer. Nobody won. The person ultimately awarded the prize was chosen at random from the submission pool, and since they had not guessed correctly, they received a cash payment instead. The writers acknowledged on the same commentary that they were aware of one person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup online on the night the first episode aired. This person appeared to have figured it out from the clues in part 1. But the account was a college internet account, and by the time the producers tried to locate them, the account was no longer active. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what this means. The show's creators designed the mystery, promoted it as solvable from the clues presented in part 1, built a national contest around the premise that an audience could deduce the answer from the available evidence, and then when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had arrived at it. Either the clues were insufficient for the audience to work with, or the red herrings were so effective they completely overwhelmed the actual evidence, or the correct answer did not follow logically from the evidence in the way the show had implied it would. Now let us examine the specific clues. The sundial. Burns falls and his hands point to W and S, or from his perspective, M and S. The show tells us this indicates Maggie Simpson, M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself, on the record in the episode, stated that the position of his hands on the sundial was not deliberate. He did not consciously position himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He simply fell, and his hands happened to land where they landed. The central piece of physical evidence that the show uses to justify the Maggie answer was explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence. The supposed clue is meaningless, according to the only person who would know. Then there is the gun. Before the shooting, there is a moment where Burns's holster is shown empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. This is significant. It means whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, which had already been removed from his holster at some earlier point in the evening. The shooter was not someone who brought a gun to the town meeting. Most of the primary suspects had brought their own weapons, specifically because they were angry enough at Burns to be contemplating violence. The person who shot Burns was someone who had not planned to shoot anyone, who encountered the gun by chance and used it impulsively. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile, but so does approximately a dozen other characters who were present and not carrying their own weapons. Burns's last words before being shot were, according to the episode's reconstruction, "Oh, it's you." Not a cry of alarm, not an exclamation of surprise. The calm, flat recognition of someone he had encountered before. Someone he was not particularly threatened by or concerned about. The question worth sitting with is, does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Does he have a prior relationship with her? An established history of interaction that would cause him to react to seeing her with that particular tone of mild, unsurprised recognition? The show has not established any meaningful relationship between Burns and Maggie before this episode. Burns barely recognizes Homer, the man who has worked for him for years. The idea that he would encounter a baby in a parking lot and greet her with the casual acknowledgement of a familiar acquaintance does not fit what we know about how Burns processes the world. And then, in season 18, something happens that the show treats as completely throwaway, but which is, if you think about it for more than a moment, an extraordinary development. Homer casually claims, on camera, in dialogue, that he was actually the one who shot Mr. Burns. He just says it, out loud, in a scene where other characters are present, and nobody reacts, nobody investigates, nobody reopens the case, nobody treats Homer's confession to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield as anything other than noise. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is genuinely possible, given who Homer is, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer knows it because he is the person who actually pulled the trigger. And if Homer did it, then a baby was blamed for a crime she did not commit. A 1-year-old infant was identified as the shooter of the richest man in town, accepted as guilty by the full weight of Springfield's legal apparatus, and left to carry that designation without the capacity to deny it or understand it. Because Maggie cannot speak, Maggie cannot defend herself. Maggie cannot say, "It was not me." And no jury would convict a baby, so there was no actual legal process through which the truth would have to be established. Maggie was a perfect scapegoat, the person least capable of contradicting the accusation and least capable of being punished for it. There is also a theory, developed by a community of fans with genuine care and analytical rigor, that the real shooter was Marge. The case for Marge is quietly compelling. Marge is a devoted mother who watched Burns systematically destroy everything her family depended on. The school her children attend lost its funding. The family dog was injured. The sun was blocked from her home. Her husband was being driven to a breaking point by a man who could not even be bothered to learn his name. Marge had motive. Marge had access to the area after the town meeting. And critically, the theory about Marge includes an explanation for why Burns would not have identified her as the shooter when he woke up from the coma. Burns was, in an earlier episode, infatuated with Marge. He attempted to pursue her romantically in the episode Marge Gets a Job. The attraction was unrequited and eventually resolved, but the show established that Burns had genuine feelings for her. Under the Marge theory, Burns woke up from the coma, recognized that Marge had been the one who shot him, and chose to protect her. He took the bullet, survived, regained consciousness, and rather than name the woman he had once loved, he let the town draw its own conclusions from a sundial that pointed in whatever direction his falling body happened to indicate. Maggie was not a deliberate frame-up. She was just the explanation that presented itself, that required no action, that allowed everyone, including Burns, to close the case and move on. The alternate endings are the final piece of evidence worth examining, because they reveal something important about the show's own relationship with the official answer. A complete alternate conclusion was animated in which Smithers is the shooter, fully written, fully voiced, fully produced, a complete ending. And this ending was eventually screened in a later clip show episode, where it was dismissed by a host character who pointed out that it could not be the real answer because the DNA evidence would have to be ignored, and ignoring DNA evidence would be, in his words, downright nutty. The show is winking at you directly in that moment. The reference is to the O.J. Simpson trial, during which a jury ignored substantial DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is pointing out, from inside itself, that juries ignore DNA evidence all the time. That the official answer is not necessarily the correct answer. That evidence points in whatever direction the people processing it want it to point. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it before abandoning it. The answer was not locked in from the beginning. The clues were adjusted to accommodate whichever answer the writers eventually settled on. The mystery was reverse engineered. The evidence does not naturally lead to Maggie. The evidence was arranged around Maggie after the fact. And the final shot of the episode, Maggie alone in the room, checking to make sure nobody is watching, then moving her pacifier in a gesture that mimics firing a gun, is the show's attempt to seal the verdict. But even this moment is ambiguous. A baby imitating something she witnessed is not the same as a baby confessing to something she did. Babies mimic the behavior of the adults around them. If Maggie watched someone else shoot Burns, she would remember it. She would recreate it. She would do exactly what she does in that final shot, alone, when she feels safe to replay the memory. Maggie is not confessing. Maggie is remembering. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The writers committed to it. The DVD commentary treats it as settled. And for the casual viewer who does not want to pull at the threads, the case is closed. But the contest that nobody won, the clues that Burns himself described as meaningless, the fully animated alternate endings, Homer's unexamined confession in season 18, and that final shot of a baby reenacting a shooting in an empty room, all of it suggests that the greatest mystery in the history of this show was never actually solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those have always been two very different things. Number. Section 4. Mr. Burns, the Immortality Engine. How is Mr. Burns still alive? This is not a rhetorical question, and it is not a joke about cartoon logic. Within the established canonical universe of The Simpsons, Charles Montgomery Burns is a genuine medical impossibility. His age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 19th century. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told first-hand stories about events from the 1910s. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most generous reading of the show's internal continuity, he might be approaching 140. And yet he not only exists, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with precision. He manipulates municipal politics. He orchestrates schemes that require sustained cognitive effort, long-range planning, and a working understanding of modern technology, modern finance, and modern law. His body is undeniably frail, his physical strength is almost non-existent, and he has been described as weighing less than a large house cat, but his mind is sharp in ways that should be impossible for someone his age. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield. He operates with a calculated ruthlessness that nobody else in the town can match, and he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained cognitive function. The show addresses the mechanism of his survival directly in the Springfield Files episode, which we have already discussed briefly in the context of the radiation theory. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment that is so intensive, so loaded with experimental compounds and controlled radiation therapy, that it causes his entire body to emit a visible green glow. Without the treatment, he dies. Not eventually, not over time. Within 7 days of a missed session, his biological systems fail and he dies. The treatment is the difference between Burns being alive and Burns being dead, and it has to be administered on a precise, non-negotiable weekly schedule. His life is maintained the way a complex machine is maintained, through scheduled servicing, through careful management of inputs and outputs, through the continuous application of external intervention to a system that cannot sustain itself independently. And the treatment involves radiation. This is the detail that transforms Burns's immortality from a throwaway cartoon convention into something more interesting and more coherent. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to stay alive. Burns is not just profiting from nuclear power, he is powered by it. His biological processes have been so thoroughly altered by a century-plus of proximity to nuclear material that they can no longer function through normal cellular mechanisms. His body requires external radiation input the way a normal human body requires food, water, and sleep. Deprive it of that input and it shuts down within the week. This explains something else the show has depicted repeatedly without ever fully explaining. Burns's immune system, or rather the extraordinary state of his immune system. In one of the most famous scenes in the entire 36-year run of the series, Burns visits a doctor who delivers a diagnosis that should be medically impossible. Burns has every disease known to medical science, present in his body simultaneously. Every one. And the doctor's explanation for why this impossibly diseased man is nonetheless functional is that all of Burns's diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium. Each one cancels out the others. They are all trying to kill him at the same time, which means none of them can actually make progress, because progress by any single disease would require resources and biological territory that all the other diseases are simultaneously competing for. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome. 3 people all trying to walk through a doorway at once. None of them can get through. The diseases are in permanent gridlock. This is played entirely for laughs, and it is one of the most frequently quoted scenes from the show's golden era. But if you accept the radiation theory of Burns's survival, it makes a very specific kind of sense. Burns's body is not maintaining that perfect disease equilibrium through any natural biological process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. The treatments do not cure his diseases, they manage them. They keep every pathogen in his body in precisely calibrated stasis, balanced against every other pathogen, so that no single condition can gain dominance and kill him. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a biological reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods. Too little intervention, and the reaction runs away from you. Too much, and you cause a different kind of catastrophic failure. The precise, scheduled, carefully controlled dosing is the only thing keeping the equilibrium stable. Smithers is not just a loyal assistant, he is a medical necessity. The show has established across dozens of episodes that Smithers manages every detail of Burns' schedule, monitors his physical condition, ensures he makes every appointment, and is the only person who fully understands the complexity of what keeping Burns alive actually requires. The show has also established that without Smithers, Burns is helpless, not emotionally dependent, physically helpless. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would collapse. Every illness in his body would surge simultaneously. The reactor would go critical. Smithers' devotion to Burns is not simply the result of love or loyalty or whatever complicated emotional bond the show has depicted between them over the years. It is also the result of Smithers knowing with complete clarity that his absence is a death sentence. He is not just devoted to Burns. He is keeping Burns alive through logistical competence and meticulous scheduling. And he knows it, and that knowledge is the foundation beneath all the other foundations of their relationship. Burns's connection to historical events adds another dimension to the immortality question. The show has depicted Burns interacting with or referencing an extraordinary range of historical moments across a span of time that no normal human lifespan could accommodate. He attended Yale. He served in World War II in a capacity the show describes as morally questionable at best, including an incident involving a $1 trillion bill that the United States government never recovered. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as history but as personal experience. He has told stories about Howard Hughes. He has described events from before the First World War as memories, rather than as things he read about. His family's wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty, as the show has depicted it across various episodes and flashbacks, is one of the oldest continuously operating concentrations of private wealth in American history. They were not simply rich. They were the kind of wealthy that shapes the physical infrastructure of nations, that builds the systems everyone else depends on, and then charges everyone else to use them, that exists so far above the reach of legal accountability that the concept of consequences becomes theoretical rather than practical. Burns inherited this legacy from a long line of predecessors, and has been extending it for well over a century. He did not build an empire. He maintained an empire that was already ancient when it came into his hands. The question the show never addresses directly is whether Burns is unique, or whether his family has always found methods to extend their lifespans beyond the normal human limit. If Burns can survive past 140 through radiation treatments and experimental medical technology, is it possible that previous generations of the Burns family employed different but equally effective methods of life extension? Before nuclear medicine, before the specific treatment regime that currently keeps Burns functional, did the Burns patriarchs of previous centuries have access to other means of staying alive long enough to maintain continuous control of the family fortune? The show does not answer this, but it does establish that the Burns family has maintained unbroken control of its wealth and institutional power for longer than most American governmental structures have existed. That kind of continuity does not happen through normal generational succession, through children inheriting from parents in the ordinary way. It requires either extraordinary luck sustained across multiple generations, or extraordinary intervention of some kind at each transition. There is also the matter of Burns's relationship with death itself, which the show has depicted in ways that are quietly strange when you add them all up. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other major character on the show. He has been shot by Maggie Simpson. He has been hospitalized on more occasions than a casual viewer could easily count. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been abandoned in wilderness conditions. He has had his medical regimen disrupted. He has faced biological crises that the doctors around him described as unsurvivable. And every single time, Burns comes back. Not through the same mechanism Homer uses to survive impossible things. Homer's recovery is passive, almost reflexive, the show simply requiring him to be functional for the next scene. Burns's recovery is active. It is managed. It is the result of a system he has spent a century building and funding and maintaining specifically to ensure that no matter what happens to his physical form, the infrastructure exists to rebuild it. Homer's immortality is a narrative convenience. Burns's immortality is an engineered outcome. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever corrupted, every politician he has ever purchased, every doctor he has ever retained, with exclusive contracts that prevent them from working for anyone else, it all serves a single, ultimate purpose: Keep burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor from going critical. Because if Burns dies, his empire begins to die with him, and empires do not allow themselves to die when they can possibly be prevented from it. The most unsettling dimension of the Burns immortality theory is not the prospect of Burns living forever. It is the realization that Springfield needs him to. The town's economy is built around the power plant. The power plant cannot function without Burns's ownership and financial backing. Burns cannot stay alive without the treatments. The treatments cannot be administered without the infrastructure his wealth provides. It is a closed system, a self-sustaining loop in which the man, the machine, and the money feed each other continuously without any outside input required. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without what Burns provides. And Burns cannot die because the system he has built over more than a century of careful work would, if it stopped, have to answer for what it has done to the people who lived inside it. Burns is not immortal. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on. Under the current treatment schedule, that might be a very long time, a nearly infinite amount of time. And the people of Springfield, drinking their contaminated water and breathing their irradiated air, their cognitive function just suppressed enough to keep them compliant, will keep going to work at the plant and keeping their heads down and not asking why their employer can remember the Spanish-American War from personal experience, because asking that question would lead to other questions, and those other questions would eventually lead to questions that Burns cannot allow to be answered. The oldest man in Springfield, the oldest man in America perhaps, sustained by a weekly treatment of radiation and experimental compounds, protected by a fortune older than the Republic, maintained by the one devoted employee whose presence is functionally equivalent to a life support machine. He is not immortal. He just has better doctors than everyone else. Section 5. Maggie Simpson, the silent mastermind. There is a member of the Simpson family who never speaks, who has not spoken in any meaningful, sustained way in 36 years of episodes, who communicates primarily through facial expressions, through the motion of a pacifier, through the occasional sound effect, who is 1 year old, who has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, without a single word, Maggie Simpson has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire and walked away without prosecution. She organized and led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker, successfully liberating herself and her fellow infants. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations through interventions that required planning, timing, and an understanding of cause and effect that should not exist in someone who has not yet learned to form sentences. She has been tested and found to possess measurable intelligence that exceeds what standardized assessment can reliably quantify. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that surpass those of adults 3 times her age in controlled situations. And through all of it, she has maintained her silence, not because she is incapable of speech, because she has chosen not to speak. Let us begin with the shooting, because it is the act that defines her in the public imagination, even if it is actually the least interesting thing about her. We have already spent time examining the who shot Mr. Burns mystery. We have gone through the evidence, considered the alternate theories, looked at Homer's subsequent confession, and examined the ambiguity of the final shot. But whether or not Maggie intentionally pulled the trigger, the aftermath tells us something important about how Maggie moves through Springfield. A baby was identified as the person who shot the most powerful man in town. The police investigated, evidence was examined, and the conclusion reached by the full weight of Springfield's legal and investigative apparatus was, yes, this infant committed an act of violence against a grown adult, and there is nothing to be done about it, because no jury would convict a baby. Chief Wiggum said this himself. And that was the end of it. Maggie was never charged, never prosecuted, never even formally questioned in any meaningful way. The case was closed, and Maggie went back to her playpen. But look at the final shot of that episode one more time, with fresh eyes. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the room slowly, deliberately, checking each corner, verifying that no one is watching. This is not a baby randomly surveying her environment. This is a scan, purposeful, methodical, thorough. Having confirmed she is unobserved, Maggie moves her pacifier in a gesture that precisely mimics the act of pulling a trigger. That sequence of behaviors requires situational awareness. It requires memory of what the trigger motion looked and felt like. It requires an understanding that performing this gesture in the presence of others would have social consequences she wants to avoid. It requires the cognitive capacity to wait, to check, and then to act only when the conditions are safe. These are not infant behaviors. These are the behaviors of someone who understands completely what happened and has decided that secrecy is the correct strategic response to her situation. This is a baby who knows what she did, knows how it is perceived, and has decided to keep that knowledge private. Now consider the short film. In 2012, a theatrical short called The Longest Daycare was produced and screened in cinemas before screenings of Ice Age: Continental Drift. It was 7 minutes long. It was nominated for an Academy Award, and it is, in many ways, the most precise and revealing 7 minutes of Maggie content the show has ever produced, because it removes the context of the larger family and focuses entirely on Maggie navigating an environment on her own terms. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility run with the kind of authoritarian efficiency that the show uses to satirize libertarian philosophy. Inside the facility, Maggie encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another baby, a recurring antagonist named Gerald, recognizable by his single prominent eyebrow, wants to destroy it. What follows is 7 minutes of Maggie outmaneuvering the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's security systems to protect the caterpillar and ensure its transformation and release are completed safely. She does all of this without speaking a word. She does it through observation of the environment, through identification of threats and the assessment of their capabilities, through the development of strategies, through improvisation when those strategies encounter unexpected obstacles, through the execution of multi-step plans that require precise timing, accurate spatial reasoning, and the ability to model and predict the behavior of other actors in the environment. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support. She falls, she stumbles, she crawls when she needs to run. Her body is a 1-year-old's body, with all the motor limitations that implies. But her decision-making is not a 1-year-old's decision-making. Every choice she makes in that short film is the correct choice. Every move is optimized for the outcome she is pursuing. Her intelligence compensates entirely for every physical limitation her body imposes, and she succeeds because of that intelligence, not in spite of those limitations. The show has directly tested Maggie's intelligence on multiple occasions, and the results, while varying in their specifics from episode to episode, are consistent in their implication. Maggie is not a normal baby. When the show bothers to measure her cognitive function formally, the results are extraordinary, off-the-charts results. Results that the show plays quickly for a laugh and then moves away from, because committing to what those results imply would require the narrative to do something with a genius infant, and the show is not ready for that. But the pattern is there. Across multiple episodes, across multiple types of measurement, Maggie consistently demonstrates cognitive abilities that should not be present in someone her age. The family does not notice. They are too consumed by Homer's disasters and Bart's provocations and Lisa's crusades to pay close attention to the baby in the corner. And that is exactly where Maggie needs them to be. Because Maggie's defining characteristic is not her intelligence, it is her silence. And the silence is a strategy. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in the Simpson family. Lisa is brilliant. Lisa is, by any reasonable measure, a genius. Someone whose intellectual capacity dwarfs not just her household but most of the adults in Springfield. And what has that intelligence done for her? Isolation, mockery, dismissal. Lisa speaks up and is ignored. Lisa challenges authority and is punished for the audacity. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and is crushed by the weight of a community that does not want to be improved, that finds her intelligence threatening and inconvenient and vaguely offensive. Lisa's intelligence is her greatest gift and her most reliable source of suffering, because she deploys it visibly. She wears it on the outside. She announces it. She walks into rooms as the smartest person present and behaves accordingly, and the rooms respond by ensuring she understands how little that matters in this particular town. Maggie has been watching this happen since the day she was born. She has been in the same house, observing the same patterns, seeing her sister fight every day for basic recognition and receive resistance and dismissal as the primary responses. Maggie has watched the most capable person in the family be consistently undervalued and overlooked by the exact community that should be drawing on her gifts. And Maggie has learned the lesson that Lisa has been unable to learn, not because Lisa is not smart enough to see it, but because Lisa is too principled to accept it. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more you can actually accomplish. Every time Maggie has done something remarkable in the course of the show, what has happened? The family does not notice. The community does not notice. Burns was shot and the investigation focused on every adult suspect, while the baby in the room was treated as a background detail. The daycare rebellion succeeded because no one monitors infants closely enough to observe them organizing. Every heroic act, every display of intelligence, every moment where Maggie has quietly intervened to save a situation that no one else could resolve it, has happened below the radar, in the margins, in the spaces between what people consider worth paying attention to. Maggie has ensured that nobody pays close attention to her by maintaining the most effective possible disguise. She pretends to be exactly what everyone in Springfield expects a baby to be: quiet, passive, dependent, helpless. Someone to be managed rather than consulted, carried rather than listened to. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them. Connect this back to the radiation theory, and the picture becomes sharper in a way that is difficult to look away from. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates biological mutations, and if those mutations affect different individuals differently depending on their specific genetic makeup and exposure patterns, then Maggie represents something remarkable. She is the opposite end of the spectrum from Homer. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to the point of clinical disability. Maggie's mutation did the opposite. It amplified her intelligence to levels that cannot be properly measured by the tools Springfield has available. Same environmental cause, same family, same contaminated water, same irradiated air, same cracked cooling towers visible from the backyard. But where the father's brain was diminished, the youngest daughter's was enhanced. Homer and Maggie are not simply father and child. Under this theory, they are two sides of the same radioactive coin. He is what mutation takes away. She is what mutation, in a different configuration, gives back. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius takes on a dimension that is almost too emotionally precise to examine comfortably. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since 1993 is the product of an unconscious mind generating a simulation of a family life it cannot actually inhabit, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, projected into the dream with the full intensity of a father who cannot watch his child grow. He cannot see her develop. He cannot observe her first steps or hear her first real sentences or watch her become whatever person she is in the process of becoming. Out in the waking world, in the hospital room time he is not present for. He cannot protect her because he is not there. He cannot prepare her because he is unconscious. So, in the dream, he makes her indestructible. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age. He makes her capable of things that no actual baby could do. And he makes her capable of doing them quietly, invisibly, without needing anyone to notice, because the deepest fear of a father who is not present is that his child will need him and he will not be there. If Maggie is extraordinary, she does not need him. If Maggie can handle anything, she will be okay. The genius is not a mutation. It is a father's prayer for a child he cannot reach. But there is a darker reading that sits alongside that one and refuses to be dismissed entirely. Maggie does not speak because she has learned that speaking gets you nothing in Springfield. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is a liability in this town. She watches. She remembers. She processes. She understands things that the adults around her are only dimly aware of. And she waits. For what? The show has never told us. Maggie's endgame is the last genuinely unsolved mystery in the Simpson family. She is the only character whose future remains completely open, because the show has never shown us what she would do with her capabilities if she decided to stop hiding them. We have seen glimpses. We have seen her shoot a man. We have seen her command a room full of other babies through sheer force of personality. We have seen her solve problems that stymie the adults around her. We have seen her confirm or refute someone's guilt with a single deliberate nod and have that judgment accepted as final. The family trusts her assessment, implicitly, intuitively, without discussion. When Maggie weighs in on something, the verdict stands, and Maggie has not yet decided what to do with that. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk reliably. She cannot speak beyond a few sounds and the motion of a pacifier. And she is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. Behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate, chosen, strategic silence, something is thinking, something is planning. Something is watching the family and the town and the power plant on the horizon with an intelligence that nobody suspects and nobody is in a position to contain. And when Maggie finally decides to act, when she finally breaks the silence and shows Springfield what she has been carrying behind that blank baby expression for all these decades, the town will not see it coming. Because that is exactly how she designed it. Number, Section 6, The Mona Simpson Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, told him his mother had passed away when Homer was a young child. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned, as much as Homer is capable of mourning things, and grew up carrying the particular weight of a boy who lost his mother early, and whose father was too emotionally constricted to fill the space she left. Homer did not know what it felt like to have a mother. He knew only the absence of one. And that absence shaped everything about him. The desperate need for approval from the people around him. The clinginess toward Marge that can tip over into something suffocating when Homer is frightened. The terror of abandonment that runs just beneath the surface of his cheerfulness. The compulsive need to be liked, to be wanted, to be valued, even by people like Burns who clearly do not value him at all. Homer would rather endure humiliation and degradation and deliberate disrespect from his employer than risk losing the one stable structure in his life, because losing things is what Homer knows happens. People leave. People disappear. The whole architecture of Homer Simpson's emotional life is a coping mechanism built around maternal loss. And in Season 7, the show revealed that the loss was a lie. The episode is Mother Simpson, and it aired in November of 1995, and it is considered by many people who have watched the show carefully to be among the greatest single episodes the series ever produced. The setup is characteristically Simpsons Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, which leads to a bureaucratic complication, which leads Marge to insist he go to the Hall of Records and correct the error. When Homer gets there, he finds something in the municipal records that changes everything he thought he knew about his life. His mother is alive, not recently deceased, not living somewhere distant under circumstances that could explain a 30-year gap, alive, and always having been alive. And Abe's story about her death was entirely false. The grave he was shown as a child did not belong to his mother, it belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been using the headstone of a famous American writer as a stand-in for his wife's burial site, for Homer's entire childhood and adolescence and adult life, and nobody had ever questioned it. Homer finds his mother at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, because she has been told that Homer died. Their reunion across a headstone that belongs to neither of them is one of the most quietly devastating scenes the show has ever produced. And when Homer proves who he is and Mona recognizes him, she has to tell him why she left. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in direct danger. She left because a specific, identifiable person destroyed her life and forced her into hiding, and that person is the same man Homer would grow up to work for without ever fully understanding the connection. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was living an ordinary life in Springfield while the world outside the town was moving through the upheavals of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the counterculture. And something changed in her. The show depicts this transformation with its characteristic blend of absurdity and genuine emotional weight. Mona became politically radicalized. She joined a group of activists, people the show refers to as hippies, but whose cause the show also makes clear was legitimate. They were not naive idealists tilting at imaginary windmills. They had identified a real target. Burns owned a germ warfare facility, a biological weapons laboratory operating within the boundaries of Springfield, producing weaponized pathogens. Not metaphorically, not as a subplot gag. A facility designed to manufacture biological weapons. In the same community where Homer was growing up and children were going to school and families were living their lives with no knowledge of what was being synthesized a few miles away. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to neutralize the biological agents stored in the facility, to render them harmless, to destroy the weapons without releasing them. The raid was successful. The pathogens were destroyed. But Mona made a single mistake in the chaos of their exit. Someone was knocked down in the confusion. She stopped to help them. The person who had been knocked down was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons laboratory she had just dismantled, because whatever her politics, she was the kind of person who could not walk past someone who needed help. Burns looked up at her. He saw her face. He committed her face to memory with the focused, cold attention of someone who has just realized they have an enemy worth tracking. And from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. Burns reported her to the FBI. The FBI opened a file. Mona could not go home. She could not contact Abe. She could not hold her son. She could not explain to him why she was leaving or when she was coming back. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping, so he would not see her go, and she disappeared into the night. Homer woke up and his mother was not there. He was told she was dead. He spent the next 27 years of his life believing, at some foundational level below conscious thought, that he was the kind of son whose mother would rather die than stay, that there was something wrong with him, something fundamentally unlovable, that made people leave. Now here is where the conspiracy expands. Burns did not simply report Mona to the FBI and consider his revenge complete. The show reveals, across multiple episodes, that Burns actively pursued her. He held a personal grudge against a woman who had destroyed his weapons program, and he used his resources and connections to ensure she could never safely return to her family. When Mona finally comes back to Springfield in the Season 7 episode, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a cab window. He makes a phone call. The FBI comes to the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. This time he is an adult. This time he knows why she is leaving. He knows who forced her out, and he knows that the man responsible is his own employer. Burns destroys Homer's mother's life. Burns drives Mona into hiding when Homer is a child. Homer grows up, emotionally damaged by a loss he cannot fully understand, and then becomes an employee of the man who caused that loss. And Homer does not connect these things. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not demand answers. The knowledge of what Burns did and the reality of working for Burns exist in Homer's mind in separate compartments that never communicate with each other. This is not played as a joke. It is played as tragedy. Because Homer Simpson is not capable of making the connection. His brain does not work that way anymore, if it ever did. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of cognitive erosion from living inside Springfield's contaminated environment, Homer is too damaged to see the architecture of his own suffering. He cannot draw the line from Burns firing Mona's son to Burns hiring Mona's son and understand what that line means. And that is the conspiracy in its most complete form. Burns did not just ruin Mona's life. He engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a young child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged in specific and predictable ways. The loss of a mother at that age, with no explanation, no goodbye, no understanding of why that creates particular kinds of wounds. Wounds that produce an adult who is desperate for approval, who is terrified of abandonment, who will endure extraordinary mistreatment rather than risk losing the structures that give him stability. An adult who will not challenge authority because authority is the only reliable thing left, and losing it would be another abandonment he is not equipped to survive. The perfect employee. A man who will work at a dangerous facility for decades without meaningful complaint because the alternative, being alone, being unloved, being abandoned again, is more frightening than any job could ever be. Homer does not work at the power plant because he is too stupid to find better employment. Homer works at the power plant because he was broken as a child by the same man who now signs his paychecks. The show confirms this conspiracy from another direction in a later episode that connects Grandpa Simpson to the whole structure. Burns had committed a crime. The specific crime varies depending on which episode is providing the information, but the general shape is consistent. Grandpa discovered what Burns had done. Burns offered Grandpa a deal. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant. No matter how many mistakes Homer made, no matter how many times he should have been fired, no matter how spectacularly he failed at the basic requirements of his position, the deal protected Homer from the consequences of his own incompetence. Homer's job security at the power plant was never just cartoon convenience. It was a contractual obligation brokered between his father and his mother's persecutor, sealed in silence, maintained in secret, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything else. The full picture, when you assemble all the pieces, is extraordinary in its darkness. Homer's mother was a political activist who chose to fight against a billionaire's illegal weapons program. That billionaire retaliated by destroying her family through the power of his FBI connections. Her husband covered up the truth and struck a deal with the man who had destroyed his marriage. Her son grew up believing he was worthless, became cognitively impaired through a combination of environmental poisoning and physical brain damage that went untreated for decades, and spent his entire adult life working for the man who took his mother from him. 3 generations of Simpsons broken and bent and shaped by one man's grudge and one town's inability or unwillingness to resist the power he represents. And Homer stands at the exact center of it, too damaged to see the pattern, too dependent to break free from it, strangling his son in the evenings in a house that runs on electricity generated by the plant that poisons his water and funds the empire of the man who stole his childhood. Burns did not just take Homer's mother, he took Homer's potential. The show proved this in the crayon episode. Without the crayon, without the physical impediment that has been suppressing his cognitive function since childhood, Homer is brilliant. He is articulate. He is capable of engaging with the world around him with a sophistication and depth that the foggy Homer we know cannot achieve. The man Homer could have been, the man he would have been if his mother had stayed, if Burns had not intervened, if the environment had not spent decades leaching into his neurons. That man exists inside Homer's skull, trapped behind a crayon and a lifetime of accumulated damage. Homer chose to put the crayon back because being intelligent in Springfield was unbearable. He could see too clearly. He understood too much. The clarity was painful in ways the fog was not, but the choice was rigged from the start. Homer was never meant to be smart in Springfield. Burns made sure of that when Homer was 6 years old, and his mother disappeared in the night. Mona Simpson died in a later episode. The death scene is one of the show's most quietly devastating. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the final time. No joke to cut the tension. No cutaway gag to soften it. No narrative reset to make the grief manageable. Just a man and his mother and the weight of 27 stolen years pressing down on both of them at once. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But beneath the jokes, beneath 36 seasons of Homer falling down and bouncing back up, beneath every absurd adventure and every celebrity cameo and every Treehouse of Horror anthology, there is this story. A family systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's compliance. A mother who fought back and lost everything that mattered. A father who made a deal with the devil and buried the truth. A son who inherited the consequences without ever understanding what they were. And Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the resources and the connections and the medical treatments writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the power plant until he dies, because his grandfather made a deal and his mother made a choice, and the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Number. Section 7. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Machinery of Denial. There is an episode of The Simpsons that fans have been calling one of the worst ever made since it first aired in 1997. It is criticized for destroying an established character, for betraying the show's relationship with its own continuity, for being a lazy and ultimately insulting piece of storytelling from writers who had run out of good ideas. Everything about the conventional critical reception of this episode is wrong. Not because the episode is flawless, it has real problems, but because the people who hate it are hating it for the wrong reasons. They think it is a show failing to maintain its own internal logic. What it actually is a show being more honest about its own internal logic than it has ever been before or since. The episode is Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It aired the 28th of September, 1997. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger arrives, a man no one in the school recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner, he says. A decorated Vietnam War veteran who was presumed dead after being captured as a prisoner of war. He survived the camp. He escaped. He came home to Springfield. and he came home to find that someone else had been living as him for the past 2 decades. The man the town has known as Principal Skinner is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street kid, a petty criminal from nowhere in particular with no prospects and no identity worth keeping. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and the unit believed he had been killed, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. When Tamzarian arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or a name that meant something to someone, made a decision in that moment. He went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the mother. He lived inside the stolen identity for 20 years, building a career and a community presence and a relationship with a woman who loved him as someone he was not. And then the real Skinner walked through the door and everything collapsed. Now here is where the episode does the thing that made fans furious. And here is why that thing is actually the most honest moment the show has produced. Springfield holds a town meeting. Both Skinners are present. The truth has been fully established and publicly acknowledged. Every person in Springfield now knows that their principal has been living a false identity for 20 years. And the town votes, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's legal identity. The town votes on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. And the verdict is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree that the imposter is, henceforth and officially, the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life occupied by someone else, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of torture. Let that settle. A community collectively decided that their comfort was more valuable than the truth. They had definitive, incontrovertible proof that a major public figure in their community had been operating under a stolen identity for 20 years. They had the actual person whose identity was stolen standing in front of them. And their response was to exile the truth-bearer and criminalize the truth itself. Fans were furious because they felt this episode destroyed everything they knew about Skinner. His military history, his relationship with Agnes, his dynamic with Bart, his entire personality, all of it was built on a lie. And the episode forced the audience to confront that while simultaneously insisting that the lie continue. What the fans were actually responding to without articulating it this clearly is that the episode made the audience uncomfortable by being honest about something the show had been quietly doing for years. Springfield has always operated this way. The collective decision to sustain a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth is not an aberration in the principal and the pauper. It is the mechanism by which Springfield functions. What makes this episode different from every other example of that mechanism is that this is the one time the show lets you watch it happen in real time, with all its machinery visible. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, ignores a contradiction, or resets to its baseline state after something world-altering occurs, the reset happens off-screen, between episodes, invisibly. The town just moves on, and nobody addresses the fact that it is moving on. The catastrophe is simply not mentioned in the next episode, and the audience is expected to accept this as episodic storytelling, which it is. But it is also something else. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode where you can see the reset mechanism operating openly. You can see the vote. You can see the legal decree. You can see the physical act of exiling the true version of events from the community. Usually this process is invisible. In this episode, it is the entire plot. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced events that should have permanently changed the town. The place has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has survived multiple nuclear near misses. It has been invaded. It has survived alien encounters, environmental catastrophes of various scales, the literal blocking of the sun. And every time by the next episode, everything is back to its prior state. Nobody references the previous catastrophe. No one seems to carry any trauma from the experience. The slate is clean. The coma theory explains this as a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory explains it as cognitive damage severe enough to impair collective memory. But the Principal and the Pauper offers a third explanation, And it is in some ways the most disturbing one. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that everyone in the community has implicitly agreed to without ever explicitly discussing it. The contract says, "We will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. We will treat the official story as the true story, and anyone who insists on departing from the official story will be removed." That is not a cartoon trope. That is how communities actually function. Small towns in particular have a well-documented capacity for collective denial. Scandals get buried. Inconvenient histories get rewritten. Uncomfortable truths about institutions people depend on get processed through social mechanisms that result in those truths being quietly set aside in favor of a version of events that allows the community to continue functioning as it has. The person who insists on the uncomfortable truth is not celebrated for their honesty. They are pressured, isolated, and eventually, if they persist, expelled from the social structures that make life in the community livable. Real Seymour Skinner is not a cartoon villain. He is the most ordinary thing in the world. He is someone who shows up with proof that the official story is a lie, and who gets exiled for it by a community that cannot afford to let the official story be a lie. Springfield does not forget because its residents are stupid. That is too simple an explanation. Springfield forgets because remembering is genuinely dangerous. If the people of Springfield remembered the dome, the episode where the federal government determined the town was so toxic it needed to be physically contained, they would have to acknowledge the pollution. Acknowledging the pollution means confronting the power plant. Confronting the power plant means challenging Burns. Challenging Burns means threatening the economic structure the entire town depends on. And threatening that structure means risking the collapse of the only thing keeping Springfield functional. So they forget. They vote to forget. They make forgetting mandatory and remembering illegal. And anyone who remembers too much gets tied to a train. The show is showing you the infrastructure of this denial explicitly in The Principal and the Pauper. It is showing you the vote, the gavel, the decree, the expulsion. It is pulling back the curtain on the mechanism that makes every reset possible and every catastrophe survivable, and it is presenting that mechanism as the plot of an episode rather than as the hidden engine of the entire show. That is why the episode matters more than its reputation suggests. If the coma theory is also true and these theories are not mutually exclusive, they stack and interlock, then the episode takes on an additional layer of significance. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire town votes to legally sustain a lie and exile the person who tells the truth. Because that is what Homer needs to believe. He needs to believe that false versions of a life can replace real ones through collective agreement and enough time passing. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real if everyone agrees to call it real. Because Homer's coma is a kind of stolen identity. The man lying in the hospital bed is the real Homer. The man walking through Springfield, going to work at the plant, strangling his son on the couch, that Homer is the dream version, the substitute, the imposter who has taken the real Homer's place in his own family for the duration of an unconscious lifetime. And as long as Springfield keeps voting to sustain the fiction, Homer never has to wake up and face which Homer he actually is. The Principal and the Pauper did not break The Simpsons. It diagnosed Springfield. It showed the audience the social machinery that makes every impossible reset possible, the mechanism that allows a contamination zone to pretend it is a normal town, a man in a coma to pretend he is awake, a community built entirely on comfortable lies to punish anyone who speaks an uncomfortable truth. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is still out there, somewhere, tied to a train, exiled from his own life. The last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. Number. Section 8. The Simpsons predictions, prophecy, pattern, or mirror. There is a phenomenon that emerged most forcefully around 2016 and has not fully subsided. The idea that The Simpsons has been accurately predicting world events. That a cartoon sitcom from 1989 has been, through some mechanism that feels like it should not exist, forecasting things that will happen years or decades in the future. The list of supposed predictions is long enough that it has its own Wikipedia page, its own corner of internet discourse, its own community of people who maintain it as evidence of something genuinely inexplicable. And the question of how to think about this phenomenon is more interesting than either the true believers or the skeptics tend to make it. Let us start with the examples that are most frequently cited, because they deserve honest examination. The year 2000 episode Bart to the Future depicts a future in which Lisa Simpson becomes the President of the United States. In that same episode, Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump, a former president whose administration has left the country in fiscal crisis that Lisa has to address on taking office. The episode aired 16 years before Trump's 2016 election victory. The internet response when this clip resurfaced during the campaign was immediate and overwhelming. Screenshots went viral. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted" it became a meme that transcended the show's fanbase entirely. People who had not watched The Simpsons in 2 decades were sharing clips and asking genuine, baffled questions about how this was possible. And that is just the most prominent example. The list continues for a remarkable distance. A 1,995 episode depicted a wrist-worn device that functions very similarly to a modern smartwatch. A 1,994 episode sent Homer to space alongside an actual astronaut, decades before commercial space tourism became a real phenomenon. A 1,998 episode contained a mathematical equation in the background of a scene, literally a prop on a chalkboard, that turns out to approximate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was not experimentally confirmed until 2012. A 1,999 episode includes a theory about the universe being shaped like a donut, a torus, and years later cosmologists identified radiation patterns that suggested the universe might actually be torus-shaped. A 1,993 episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia spreading to Springfield, causing mass panic, overwhelming the local healthcare system, producing hoarding behavior, and generating a frantic search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. During that fictional outbreak, townspeople accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which felt eerily specific when Asian giant hornets, labeled murder hornets, by the media appeared in the United States in 2020 during the actual pandemic. In 1996, an episode featured the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra as part of a mix-up while under the influence. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the event? A 1,998 episode depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox, which Fox at the time owned The Simpsons through. Disney actually acquired Fox in 2019. Multiple episodes across the series depicted video calling technology before it was common, autocorrect failures before smartphones existed, and various forms of surveillance culture before those things had entered daily life in any meaningful way. Now, how should a thoughtful person think about all of this? The official explanation, offered by Al Jean and other show veterans, is blunt. If you throw enough darts at a large enough target for long enough, you will hit the bullseye sometimes. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of observations about American culture, technology, politics, and social behavior. When you generate that volume of satirical content over that span of time, some percentage of it is going to align with future events through the basic operation of statistical probability. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak creative seasons, put it another way. There are very few cases where The Simpsons genuinely predicted something. Most of it is coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history tends to repeat itself in some form. Fact-checking organizations have examined the most popular claims and found that many of them involve misremembering, significant stretching of the parallel, or the selective presentation of a show with hundreds of episodes in ways that emphasize the hits and ignore the abundant misses. The Trump prediction, specifically, is a good example of how more mundane explanations account for the seemingly impossible. Trump had been publicly flirting with a presidential run since the late 1980s. He had taken out newspaper ads in 1988 suggesting he should run. He had appeared on talk shows discussing the possibility. By 2000, the idea of Trump as a future president was not a random prediction from nowhere. It was a satirical observation about the logical direction of a culture already moving towards celebrity politics. The writers did not predict Trump's presidency. They noticed Trump's ambitions. noticed the cultural momentum toward treating celebrity as a qualification for power, and wrote a gag about where that trajectory pointed. The Disney-Fox merger worked similarly. Media consolidation was an accelerating and visible trend by 1998. Large entertainment conglomerates were actively acquiring competitors. The show made a joke about a mega corporation swallowing everyone else, because that was the obvious direction the industry was already moving, not because anyone in the writer's room had access to information from the future. The Simpsons writing staff, particularly during the show's peak years, was one of the most educated in American television history. Multiple writers had degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite institutions. Many had backgrounds in mathematics, hard sciences, computer science, and political theory. These were not people generating random guesses. They were intelligent, well-read, deeply engaged observers of American culture who spent their careers studying patterns in how the country moved and then extrapolating those patterns to their logical and often absurd conclusions. They were not predicting the future. They were reading the present more carefully than most people bother to, and then projecting it forward a few steps. But even accounting for all of that, even granting the full weight of the statistical probability argument, the confirmation bias argument, the intelligent writers extrapolating trends argument, some of the coincidences are specific enough to give pause. The Trump prediction did not just broadly forecast celebrity politics, it specified Trump by name and depicted him in a visual context that maps closely onto specific imagery from his actual 2015 campaign announcement. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just make a general observation about exotic animal acts being unpredictable. It depicted a specific type of attack by a specific type of animal in a way that corresponds quite precisely to what actually happened when Roy Horn was critically injured by a white tiger in 2003. These are not vague trend extrapolations. They are specific details that align with future events in ways that make the statistical probability argument feel slightly less comfortable than it does in theory. Here is where the most interesting lens on this phenomenon lies, and it is not a supernatural one. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. This is not mystical. It is cultural mechanics. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in the entire history of American media. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own culture. Its jokes have become part of the language through which Americans talk about their society. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people mention when they discuss Trump's political ambitions, something that floats in the cultural imagination as an example of where certain tendencies lead. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes the future feel familiar. It primes the cultural imagination to accept a particular possibility as already imagined, already considered, already processed. And when the possibility eventually becomes reality, when reality catches up to the joke, it does not feel like prediction. It feels like recognition. We have seen this. The Simpsons already did this. There is something deeply odd about a society that has culturally pre-processed a future it has not yet reached, and then arrives at that future and experiences not shock but a strange sense of having been there before. The show did not predict Disney buying Fox. The show made media consolidation feel like the inevitable, obvious conclusion of trends that were already visible, and then 20 years later, when those trends reached their conclusion, the cultural response was not surprise. It was, of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this was coming. That is not prophecy. That is influence. The show's satire does not forecast outcomes. It normalizes them. It takes the trajectory of things already in motion and presents them as accomplished facts, and the audience absorbs this presentation and incorporates it into their model of what the future is likely to hold. And then the future arrives and matches the model, and everyone who has seen the episode experiences a jolt of recognition that feels, from the inside, exactly like déjà vu. Springfield has not been reflecting America. America has been slowly becoming Springfield. The nuclear power plant. The corrupt billionaire who everyone depends on but nobody can successfully challenge. The incompetent government apparatus that is more concerned with self-preservation than public service. The population too distracted, too overwhelmed, too cognitively loaded by daily life to notice how thoroughly they are being exploited. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset, of crisis and collective amnesia, of the same problems recurring because the structural causes of those problems are never addressed. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was in 1989. The show just wrote it down, and then held up the mirror for 36 years while America stared at itself and slowly began to resemble what it saw. The final piece of this that matters is the confirmation bias point, because it is worth being honest about. The Simpsons has also made jokes that did not come true. Many of them. Jokes about jetpacks and moon colonies and technological developments that never materialized. Jokes about political outcomes that went in entirely different directions. Jokes about cultural shifts that the culture turned away from. Nobody shares those on social media. Nobody builds theories around the predictions that missed, because the audience for this kind of content is not interested in the misses. The mental architecture that makes the hit episodes feel like prophecy is exactly the same architecture that renders the miss episodes invisible. Confirmation bias only processes evidence that confirms the pattern it has already decided to see. When you take 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about every dimension of American life, and you filter those observations through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created, which is the internet, where anything that fits a satisfying narrative spreads instantly, and anything that does not simply does not spread, you end up with a highlight reel that looks exactly like prophecy. It is not, but knowing how the trick works does not make it entirely stop working. The next time a Simpsons clip from 1994 aligns precisely with a headline from today, even someone who fully understands the statistical probability argument and the confirmation bias argument will feel a small, involuntary chill, because The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to arrive, and the ones that arrived are the only ones anyone remembers. And even understanding that, even holding the full rational explanation in your mind, there is something in the experience of watching a joke become reality that resists purely logical processing. Some part of the mind, looking at that alignment, cannot help but wonder. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of observations, and enough precise hits to make even the show's own writers pause sometimes, in interviews, and phrase their dismissals a little more carefully than you might expect from people who are absolutely certain the hits are coincidental. Maybe they are, probably they are, but probably is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Number. Section 9. Where is Springfield, the town that cannot be found? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in the history of American television. More people can name Springfield's nuclear power plant than can name the capitals of half the states in the actual country. More people know the name of Springfield's elementary school than know the name of their own congressional representative. And nobody knows where it is. Not which state, not which region, not which part of the country. The show has been running for 36 years and has spent those years actively and deliberately ensuring that the question of Springfield's location cannot be conclusively answered. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow the possibilities, another clue appears in a different episode that contradicts it entirely. The show teases an answer, creates the impression that the puzzle can be solved, and then quietly introduces a new element that renders the previous apparent solution impossible. The result is a town that has oceanfront property and mountain ranges, and desert conditions and active volcanoes and farmland all within driving distance of each other, which corresponds to no actual geography in the United States. Springfield borders Ohio and Nevada, and Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you are watching. It is on the coast. It is in the heartland. It is near the Canadian border. It is near Mexico. Its weather ranges from blizzard conditions to tropical heat within a single season. Springfield does not exist in any state because it appears to exist in all of them simultaneously. The history of the location question is worth going through carefully, because the way the show has handled it reveals something about why the mystery persists. In 2012, Matt Groening, the show's creator, gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in which he was more directly candid about the inspiration for Springfield's name than he had ever been before. He said he chose Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in America. There are Springfields in dozens of states, and because he grew up near Springfield, Oregon. He named the town for his home state. For approximately 48 hours after that interview published, the mystery was solved. Springfield was in Oregon. And then the show continued. Episodes aired that placed Springfield in geographic contexts completely inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor the creator's confession. They kept contradicting it because the contradiction was the point. Groening could name the inspiration, but the show's universe had long since evolved past any commitment to a specific real-world location. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is not a production error. It is not writers being careless about continuity. It is a deliberate, sustained, carefully maintained creative decision to keep the location permanently unresolvable. Matt Groening has explained the design philosophy directly. Springfield is meant to feel like every American town, to resonate with viewers regardless of where they actually live. The intention was always universality. A Springfield that existed definitively in Oregon would feel like Oregon's Springfield. A Springfield that could be anywhere is everyone's Springfield. This is true, and it is probably the complete explanation at the level of authorial intention. But apply the lens of the theories we have been exploring, and the geographic impossibility becomes something more than a clever creative strategy. If the radiation theory is true, if Springfield is a contamination zone where the laws of biology have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure, then why should geography be exempt from the same distortion? If the people of Springfield can have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive physical trauma that should kill them, if the animals can develop extra organs, if the billionaire employer can be kept alive by weekly radiation treatments that cause bioluminescence, why should the physical landscape of the town obey normal geographic rules? Maybe Springfield has both mountains and coastline because the contamination does not just affect biological systems. Maybe it affects the spatial relationships between physical features. Maybe the radiation has compressed geography in the same way it has compressed biological time. If the coma theory is true, the explanation is more psychologically coherent but no less strange. Homer's unconscious brain does not have a precise internal map of America. It has impressions, fragments, emotional associations, mountains from a vacation he half remembers, an ocean from something he saw on television, a desert from a movie, farmland from driving through a state he passed through once without really paying attention. Homer's dreaming mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered in any form, layered without regard for geographic logic, because dreams do not require geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. And Springfield feels like America resonates with America, creates in every viewer some sense of familiarity because it is made from Homer's fragmented, incomplete, longing-inflected memory of America itself. If the principle and the pauper theory is true, if Springfield operates through collective denial and the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate expression of that collective denial. You cannot investigate a town you cannot definitively locate. You cannot bring regulatory action against a nuclear power plant if the jurisdiction it sits in changes from episode to episode. You cannot hold anyone accountable for environmental contamination if the state responsible for environmental oversight is permanently undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means that someone can show up with a badge and a map and start asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who remember the Spanish-American War firsthand. As long as Springfield's location is contested, uncertain, undetermined, no single regulatory body has clear authority over it. The EPA has to argue about jurisdiction. The state attorney general has to establish which state's laws apply. The legal and regulatory frameworks that might protect the town's residents from what is being done to them are all premised on knowing where exactly the town is, and that is information that Springfield never fully provides. The geographic uncertainty is not a comedy device. It is a legal shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent state attorney general to investigate the nuclear facility's 342 violations. Springfield cannot be held to account because Springfield cannot be precisely located. Every time someone gets close, the town moves. The episode Behind the Laughter, the 12th season's mockumentary about the Simpson family, offers the clearest example of how the show handles the location question when it briefly appears to commit to an answer. In the original broadcast, the family is identified as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, The location was changed. The answer literally depends on which version of the episode you are watching. The show gave you a definitive answer and then changed the definitive answer depending on the distribution platform. Even when Springfield has a location, that location is not stable. There is a version of the geographic mystery that is simply aesthetic philosophy. Every American watching the show should feel like Springfield could be their town. That version is probably the right explanation at the level of the show's actual creative intentions. But there is a version of the geographic mystery that sits underneath the aesthetic philosophy, underneath the clever universality of it all, and asks a simpler question. What does it mean to live in a place that cannot be found? What does it mean that the people of Springfield inhabit a community so thoroughly defined by its own contradictions that even its location in physical space is unresolvable? What does it mean to be a resident of a town whose coordinates cannot be pinned, whose regulatory identity shifts with each episode, whose relationship to the physical geography of the country around it defies every attempt at systematic mapping? It means you cannot leave. Not really. Not in the way that requires you to know where you are leaving from. It means the town exists in a kind of permanent geographic limbo that corresponds exactly to the permanent temporal limbo of its floating timeline, the permanent cognitive limbo of its radiation-damaged population, and the permanent narrative limbo of its coma-dreaming center of consciousness. Springfield is everywhere and nowhere. It is every town and no town. It belongs to everyone and therefore to no one. And you cannot shut down something you cannot find. That is the point. That has always been the point. The town's geographic impossibility is not incidental to what Springfield is. It is fundamental to what Springfield can keep being. Unfindable, unlocatable, permanently between one place and another, suspended in a geographic uncertainty that mirrors every other kind of uncertainty the show has maintained for 36 years. Springfield will never be located. Not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided long ago that the mystery is more useful than the answer. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone, and a town that belongs to everyone can keep running for as long as people keep watching. Number. Section 10. The floating timeline. Why nobody ages. We have arrived at the central mystery, the one that sits at the heart of everything we have covered tonight, the one that all the other theories converge on when you follow any of them far enough. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now, in whatever year you are watching this. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1. She is still 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They are in their mid-30s still. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The characters exist in a permanent present tense. They are locked at the ages they were when the show began, living through decade after decade of cultural change, different technology, different references, different political landscapes without adding a single candle to their birthday cakes. The world around them evolves at the normal pace of time. They do not. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in a given year, the characters are living in that year. The technology matches, the references match, the cultural moment matches. But the characters do not age. The year changes, they do not. The floating timeline is the standard approach for long-running animated series, and most people accept it without sustained examination because it is simply how these shows work. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so massive and so bizarre that they have started to visibly crack the foundations of the show's own internal reality. The most obvious problem is Homer and Marge's origin story. When the show began, their history was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love during a period when the cultural reference points were specific to that era. The fashions, the music, the social atmosphere of their formative years were all consistent with parents who would be in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. The backstory was anchored, but as the floating timeline dragged the present forward, the anchor dragged with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in 1980. They met around 2005, which means their high school experience was not defined by Watergate and disco. It was defined by MySpace and early YouTube. The show has actually depicted this shift. In later flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's formative years have been quietly rewritten to include references to the 1990s, then the 2000s, then the 2010s. The love story is always the same love story. But the era keeps sliding forward because the timeline demands it. Their origin story has been retold at least 4 distinct times, each version placing their youth in a different decade. This means Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. Their history is a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of a permanent present. Their memories are unstable. Their origin is subject to revision without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without anyone in the show or in the production team treating this as something worth addressing. Characters in a floating timeline do not have histories. They have approximations. Whatever backstory is needed for the current episode is the backstory that exists in that moment. When a different backstory is needed for a different episode, the previous one is silently discarded. Apply the theories now, because each one arrives at the same fact through a different route. The coma theory: nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer's dreaming brain cannot generate new aging data because it has no access to a timeline that extends beyond the moment he went under. The dream locks his family at the ages they were in April 1993, because those are the only ages his stored memory can supply. Of course, Bart is always 10. Homer went to sleep when Bart was 10, and that is the Bart that Homer's unconscious mind has to work with. The radiation theory: nobody ages because their biology has been so fundamentally mutated by decades of nuclear contamination that the cellular mechanisms responsible for aging have been altered at the molecular level. The mutation that gives Homer his extraordinary physical resilience, his ability to survive injuries that should be fatal, may be the same mutation that prevents the normal progression of cellular senescence. The radiation that poisons them also, accidentally, preserves them. The principal and the pauper theory: nobody ages because Springfield has collectively agreed not to age. The same social contract that allows the town to vote to sustain a lie, to exile an uncomfortable truth, to criminalize the acknowledgement of things that disturb the agreed-upon version of reality, that same contract applies to time itself. The people of Springfield have agreed without ever saying it out loud that the Simpsons are the ages they are and always will be. Anyone who insisted that Bart should be in his mid-40s by now would be met with the same response as the real Seymour Skinner. The Burns immortality theory: at least one person in Springfield has found a way to suspend the normal aging process through technological and pharmaceutical intervention. If Burns can remain functionally alive at 140 through the right combination of treatments, the concept of aging is already established as negotiable in this universe. The question is not whether aging can be cheated in Springfield. The question is who else has access to the means of cheating it. And the prediction theory: the show exists in a feedback loop with American culture that has run long enough to warp the distinction between the show's fictional timeline and the real timeline of its audience. The Simpsons is not just a show Americans watch. It is part of the cultural infrastructure Americans use to understand their world. And a cultural infrastructure that has been running for 36 years without its central characters aging has done something subtle and strange to the way its audience relates to time. Every single theory we have explored arrives at the same conclusion: time does not work in Springfield. Something about the place, whether it is the radiation, or the coma, or the collective denial, or the billionaire's technology, or some combination of all 4 operating together, has broken the normal flow of time for everyone who lives there. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is a symptom. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done this explicitly and with genuine emotional richness. In the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the show flashes forward to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman preparing to marry. The future depicted is detailed and specific and emotionally sophisticated. Lisa has grown into the person the show always suggested she would become: intelligent, principled, lonely in particular ways, searching for a kind of connection that the world around her keeps failing to provide. The episode proves that the show can imagine its characters with futures. It can envision who they would become if time were permitted to pass normally. But it closes that window. Lisa returns to being 8. The future is sealed away. The permanent present resumes as though the glimpse had not occurred. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. This refusal is worth sitting with, because it is not just a logistical decision. It is a statement. The Simpsons is the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium: 36 years. Multiple generations of real viewers have grown up alongside them, and then continued watching after they grew up, and continued watching still. The Simpsons are a fixture of American cultural life in a way that very few fictional creations ever become. And the American family, as the show has depicted it, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must always be middle-aged and overwhelmed. Marge must always be patient and quietly sustaining the structure around her. Bart must always be rebellious and searching for connection through misbehavior. Lisa must always be idealistic and isolated by her own intelligence. Maggie must always be silent and watching. Because the moment the Simpson family ages, the moment Bart goes to college, the moment Lisa moves away, the moment Maggie begins to speak, the moment Homer retires and Marge is left in an empty house on Evergreen Terrace, the show is no longer a comedy. It is an elegy. It becomes the story of a family that ran out of time, of a household that existed with extraordinary vividness and then, like all households, eventually stopped. America does not want that story. Or, more precisely, America is not ready for that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young, and the parents are always together, and the house is always the same, and the beer is always cold, and the couch gag always plays, and the family always makes it home to each other by the end of the episode. America wants the version where the specific entropy that eventually comes for every family, that eventually empties every house and silences every dinner table, has not arrived yet and maybe will not arrive. Because as long as the show is running, as long as the timeline is floating, it hasn't arrived yet. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them to be. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the walls are still standing, and the family is still whole, and the timeline is still floating just above the ground, not quite landing anywhere, not quite committing to a year that would require things to have consequences. And every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before most of us could talk, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it harder for the Simpsons to escape. Because if they escape, if the timeline stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9, and Maggie finally speaks her second word and means it, then the show ends. And the show ending means admitting that the version of America The Simpsons represents the chaotic, resilient, stubborn, loving, infuriating, indestructible version of the middle-class American family was always fragile, was always temporary, was always one birthday away from becoming something we do not recognize anymore. The Simpsons are trapped in a loop because we trapped them there. We pressed pause in 1989 and we have never let ourselves press play. And here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family on the same street in the same impossible town, waiting for something to change, knowing nothing will. Because we will not let it. Number. Section 11. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the Quiet Tragedies. Before we reach the final section, there are two quieter mysteries that deserve their own space. They are not as grand as the radiation theory or as emotionally expansive as the coma theory, but they are the mysteries that, once you see them, stay with you longest, because they are about the characters the show loves least obviously and punishes most consistently. The first is a body count. If you have watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know Hans Moleman. He is the tiny, elderly, nearly blind man who appears in the backgrounds of Springfield scenes and whose primary dramatic function in the show is to suffer. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by various heavy objects. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning, incinerated, walked into by crowds who simply do not see him. He walks into traffic and disappears under tires. By conservative estimate, Hans Moleman is the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The show has killed him dozens of times, not in Treehouse of Horror episodes where death is decorative and explicitly non-canonical. In regular, weekly, This Is Part of the Show episodes, Moleman dies and then appears in the next episode completely functional and unharmed, with no explanation for his return and no acknowledgement from any other character that he was dead 2 episodes ago. He arrives for another installment of suffering with the patient reliability of a commuter catching a train. Most viewers accept this as a running gag with no deeper content. Moleman dies a lot. The show finds this funny. Move on. But apply the theories and the running gag becomes much stranger. Under the radiation theory, Moleman represents the most extreme mutation in Springfield. A man whose biology has been so profoundly altered by chronic nuclear exposure that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. Homer endures damage and heals. Molman actually dies, ceases biological function, and then comes back. Death in Springfield, under this reading, is not a permanent condition for certain individuals. It is a temporary state from which the right kind of mutation allows return. Molman is not a background gag. He is evidence of the power plant's most extreme biological effect. Under the coma theory, Molman is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind generates to populate scenes, but does not maintain with sufficient attention to ensure continuity between episodes. He dies because the dream loses track of him, and he comes back because the dream needs him to fill a background role in the next scene. He is a prop that the dreaming mind occasionally breaks and reassembles without noticing. Under the collective denial theory, Molman's deaths are another thing the town has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, visibly, in front of witnesses, repeatedly, and no one investigates. No coroner is called. No obituary is published. No one asks how he came back. Springfield has normalized Molman's death cycle the same way it normalized everything else that should be alarming, through the quiet, communal decision to simply not engage with it. But the single most unsettling Molman detail is not his repeated deaths. It is a line he delivers in a single episode, almost as a throwaway, that is easy to miss if you are not listening carefully. Molman states his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s at minimum, possibly older. His face is deeply lined. His eyes are nearly useless. His posture is that of someone who has been worn down by extreme age over an extremely long time. If he is telling the truth about being 31, and there is no reason, within the show's universe, to assume he is lying, then something has aged him catastrophically and prematurely. Something took a man who should be in the early prime of his life and turned him into a figure who looks as though he has been old for decades. Something that also made him effectively indestructible despite his apparent frailty. Something that made death a revolving door rather than a terminal exit. The radiation theory has a complete and coherent answer for all of this. The coma theory has an answer. The collective denial theory has an answer. The only theory that does not have an answer is the one that says The Simpsons is just a cartoon and none of this means anything in particular. Now, Ned Flanders. Ned is the character the show has quietly, systematically, thoroughly dismantled more completely than any other, and the darkness that hides behind his relentless positivity is one of the most disturbing subtexts in the entire 36-year run of the series. On the surface, Ned Flanders is everything Homer Simpson is not. He is kind where Homer is selfish. He is generous where Homer is grasping. He is devoutly religious where Homer is casually faithless. He is physically disciplined where Homer is aggressively indulgent. He is financially responsible where Homer is in constant economic precarity. He is a genuinely good father where Homer is a loving but profoundly unreliable one. He is, by any objective measure, a substantially better person than Homer in virtually every area where measurement is possible. And the show punishes him for it without mercy and without end. Ned's wife Maude was killed in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway when a t-shirt cannon misfired and sent t-shirts flying in a direction she happened to be standing. She was knocked from the bleachers and died. And the reason the cannon misfired in that direction, rather than firing away from Maude, is that Homer ducked to avoid the t-shirts, causing the fan operating the cannon to redirect it. Homer's instinctive self-preservation reflex killed Ned's wife. Ned forgave him, because that is what Ned does. He forgives, he absorbs, he turns the other cheek. He receives punishment after punishment from the universe, from his neighbor, from circumstances that seem designed with the specific purpose of afflicting him, and he responds with grace and patience and a faith that God has a plan, and that the plan, whatever it is worth trusting. Then his house is destroyed by a hurricane. The town rallies to rebuild it, which is touching in principle. But the actual rebuild, carried out by untrained volunteers operating without proper materials or skills, is so shoddily executed that the completed house collapses almost immediately after the ceremony marking its completion. Ned stands in front of the rubble and something in him breaks. He snaps. He has a complete psychological breakdown. In public, in front of the entire town. He screams. He says the things he has been compressing and suppressing for his entire adult life. He insults everyone who has wronged him. He says the unsayable things. And then he is institutionalized. He is committed to a mental health facility where the story of his niceness is finally explained. Ned was a violent child, uncontrollably, dangerously violent. His parents, beatniks who did not believe in discipline of any kind, brought him to a psychiatrist as a last resort. The psychiatrist spent years using what the show depicts as behavioral modification therapy to condition the aggression out of Ned. He literally reprogrammed the boy. The rage did not go away. It was suppressed, contained, walled off behind a psychological structure built to keep it permanently inaccessible. Ned's kindness is not a character trait. It is a cage, built around a feral child by a doctor who understood that the only way to make young Ned socially functional was to remove his access to his own negative emotional responses. Ned cannot express anger because his brain was conditioned to route around anger at all costs. The capacity for rage is still there. The conditioning encounters it and redirects always. Read everything about Ned's life through this lens, and it shifts completely. His patience with Homer is not saintly. It is pathological. He literally cannot allow himself to feel the rage that Homer's behavior consistently and justifiably provokes. The forbearance he shows is not virtue. It is the output of a system that was installed without his consent when he was a child. His religious faith is not spiritual conviction in the way it reads at surface level. It is the external framework that a man who has had his internal emotional architecture removed needs in order to organize his experience of the world. Without faith, without the structure of belief that tells him suffering has purpose and patience has reward, Ned would have nothing to process his experience through. The faith is load-bearing. It is doing the work that Ned's conditioning prevents his own emotional responses from doing. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. It is the pre-programmed response of a man who was wired as a child to never allow himself, under any circumstances, to feel the specific emotion that the specific situation most warrants. And the show knows all of this. It has shown what happens when the conditioning fails. When Ned snaps, when the hurricane and the collapsing house finally push the load past what the conditioning can hold, the person underneath is not evil. But the despair that emerges is bottomless. Ned Flanders is a man who has spent his entire adult life performing goodness, because the alternative, the person who lives underneath the conditioning, the feral child who was wired into compliance, the man who cannot feel the things that his experience entitles him to feel, is someone that neither he nor Springfield can afford to release. Here is the detail about Ned that is most difficult to sit with. God talks to Homer, not metaphorically, literally. The show has depicted Homer having direct, face-to-face, verbal conversations with God on multiple occasions. Homer who sleeps during church, Homer who has no particular religious conviction and has never cultivated his relationship with the divine in any systematic way, Homer whose personal piety is essentially non-existent. Homer talks to God and God responds. God has never spoken to Ned Flanders. Not once, not in any episode, not through any channel. The man who attends church without fail, the man who prays earnestly and regularly and with genuine belief, the man who has organized his entire life around his faith and whose relationship with his God is the central organizing principle of everything he does, that man gets silence. The drunk who falls asleep in church gets divine conversation. The devoted man who has given his whole life to faith gets nothing. This is not random cruelty. The show is not simply punishing Ned for being virtuous as a form of ironic humor. The show is making a precise statement about how its universe actually works. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Kindness is not protected. Faith is not answered. The systems that govern life in this town, whether it is Burns's empire or the radiation or the coma or the collective denial or some combination of all four, do not care about moral behavior. They care about compliance. And Ned is the most thoroughly compliant person in Springfield. He was programmed into compliance before he was old enough to choose. His reward is a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor who will never genuinely appreciate him, and a God who talks to everyone in Springfield except the one person who is actually listening. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that does not punish wrongness. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, between the man who tries and the man who does not, between the man for whom things go badly despite his goodness, and the man for whom things ultimately resolve despite his failures, has never once closed. Because in Springfield, the gap does not close. The system is not designed to close it. The system is designed to keep everyone exactly where they are. Homer at the plant, Ned at the church, Burns at the top, Moleman in the ground. And the Simpsons on the couch, watching their television, living their lives, trapped in the most comfortable loop that was ever designed to hold someone in place. Number. Section 12. Everything connects the final theory. We have spent a long time in Springfield now. It is late wherever you are. The house is quiet, and it is time to pull everything together to look at what all of these theories share, what they are all trying to say, and what the accumulation of 36 years of buried evidence, unresolved storylines, and fan theories eventually resolves into when you follow every thread to where it actually leads. Let us start with what we know, because there is more we know than is sometimes acknowledged. We know that the Springfield nuclear power plant has 342 documented safety violations that its owner refused to remediate. We know that radioactive waste has been dumped into local waterways. We know that the fish in those waterways have developed a third eye. We know that the federal government, in the show's own canonical universe, determined that Springfield was toxic enough to require physical containment under a dome. We know that Burns undergoes weekly treatments that cause visible bioluminescence. We know that Homer lost 5% of his brain function during a coma in 1993. We know that Homer's mother was a political activist driven underground by Burns for 27 years, which means Homer grew up without her, which means Homer's emotional architecture was shaped by that absence in ways the show has depicted across hundreds of episodes. We know that Maggie shot someone and was never prosecuted. We know that the town voted to sustain a false identity and exile the man who knew the truth. We know that Burns has been alive for well over a century by any reading of the show's continuity. We know that nobody in Springfield ages. We know that Springfield cannot be located on any map. We know that the show's timeline keeps rewriting the past while the present stays frozen. All of that is in the show. None of it is fan invention. The theories are not importing ideas into Springfield from outside. They are reading what is already there and following the implications. And what the implications converge on is this. Springfield is a system. A closed, self-sustaining, deliberately maintained system. And every anomalous thing about the town, every reset, every impossibility, every mystery is a feature of that system rather than a bug in the writing. The radiation theory explains the biology. Why the residents look the way they do, why they survive what they survive, why nobody ages at the cellular level, why the cognitive function of the population is compromised in ways that prevent collective resistance to the conditions they live under. The coma theory explains the narrative. Why the show becomes increasingly surreal over time. Why events do not have lasting consequences. Why the tone shifts so dramatically from the early seasons. Why Homer is at the center of everything, even when his direct involvement makes no logical sense. The denial theory explains the social mechanism. Why the town resets after catastrophes. Why nobody asks questions about things that should demand questions. Why the official story always prevails and the person who challenges it is always removed. The Burns immortality theory explains the economic structure. Why the system persists despite being obviously harmful to everyone inside it. Why no outside force has successfully shut it down. Why the people who could change things choose not to, or are not capable of choosing to. And the prediction theory explains the relationship between Springfield and the world outside it. Why the show feels like a mirror rather than a fantasy. Why what happens in Springfield keeps happening, in some form or another, in the actual country the show is drawing from. These theories do not contradict each other. They describe the same thing from different angles, like 6 people standing around a table and describing the object on it from where they are standing. Each description is partial. Each one emphasizes the features visible from that position, but they are all describing the same table. Springfield is a contamination zone whose residents have been cognitively damaged enough to be compliant, run by a man who has cheated death long enough to become permanent, maintained through collective social denial and systematic exile of inconvenient truths, dreamed into existence by an unconscious man who only wanted his family back, reflecting an America that keeps recognizing itself in the show's satire because the satire was always about what was already true. It is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. It will probably keep being a comedy for as long as anyone keeps watching, and possibly longer than that. But underneath the comedy, running through it like wiring through the walls of a house, is something else. Homer's mother was taken from him by the richest man in town, and Homer spent his adult life working for that man without understanding what had been done to him. Lisa is the most intelligent person in Springfield, and the show rewards her intelligence with isolation, dismissal, and the particular loneliness of someone who understands more than the people around them and has no one to talk to about it. Maggie is perhaps the most capable person in the family and has decided, wisely, that Springfield is not a safe place to demonstrate capability. Marge holds the whole structure together through a combination of love and patience and determined optimism that the show sometimes honors and sometimes takes for granted. Bart is searching, always searching, for a version of himself that his father will see clearly enough to recognize. And Homer is in a hospital bed dreaming the only dream worth having. Or Homer is irradiated and cognitively compromised and still showing up to a job he is catastrophically unqualified for, because the alternative is to be alone. Or Homer is both, and the distinction between those two readings matters less than the thing they share. Homer loves his family. Homer has always loved his family. Every theory in this video, every buried storyline, every accumulated anomaly comes back to that. A father and his family, in a house on a street in a town that cannot be found, suspended in amber at a moment that was almost perfect, if you do not look too closely at the cooling towers. The radiation makes the impossibility biological. The coma makes the impossibility psychological. The denial makes the impossibility social. The immortality makes the impossibility economic. But the impossibility itself, the fact that a family has been preserved in a specific moment for 36 years, without change, without growth, without loss. That is something all four theories are describing from their own angle. Springfield is a place that refuses to let things end. And the reason is sitting on the couch in a house that looks exactly the same as it did in 1989, surrounded by a family that looks exactly the same as it did in 1989, watching television in the specific, small, enormously consequential way that a man watches television when the television and the couch and the family are everything he has and everything he needs. The show has 788 episodes. Most of them are about Homer trying to do something, failing at it in various ways, and ending up back where he started, in the house, with his family, where the thing that was at risk of being lost has been recovered or preserved, or simply persisted despite the odds against it. That is the whole show. Every episode, in miniature. The attempt, the failure, the return. And what that loop represents, what it has always represented, is the thing that all the theories are dancing around without quite saying directly. Every family ends. Every house becomes a house that someone used to live in. Every child grows up and every parent gets older, and every family dinner table eventually becomes a table where not everyone shows up anymore. That is what time does. That is the only thing time ever actually does. And The Simpsons is a show about a family that refuses to let time do what time does. That refuses to let the children grow and the parents age and the house empty. That refuses, episode after episode, season after season, decade after decade, to arrive at the conclusion that every real family eventually arrives at. We watch because we refuse to. We tune in every week or every night at 3 in the morning when we cannot sleep, or on lazy Sunday afternoons, or as background noise in a quiet house, because as long as the show is running, as long as the loop is intact, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling home from work, and the whole family is tumbling onto the couch at the same time, it is not over. They are not over, and neither are we. The radiation is real. The coma might be real. The denial is absolutely real. Burns is genuinely inexplicable. Maggie is watching everything. The town cannot be found. The timeline refuses to land. And at the center of all of it, in a house on Evergreen Terrace in a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, a family that should have aged decades ago sits together in the light of a television, and everything is wrong, and everything is impossible, and the nuclear power plant is still leaking, and the fish still have 3 eyes. And Homer is home. And for now, for this episode, for this hour of late-night watching, that is enough. It has always been enough. That is Springfield. That is 36 seasons and 788 episodes, and the longest-running animated series in the history of American television, reduced to its simplest and most honest form. A man who loves his family, a loop that will not break, a town that cannot be found, and all of us, wherever we are, whatever time it is, choosing to go back. One more time, Think about what it would mean to live your entire life in a town like Springfield and never once question the environment around you. Most people, if they moved to a new place and noticed that the local fish had developed extra eyes, would react with alarm. They would contact the EPA, they would speak to local journalists, they would organize. They would demand answers from whoever was responsible for the waterway those fish were living in. But Springfield does not do any of those things. And the radiation theory argues that this is not a coincidence, and it is not simply a matter of the townspeople being credulous or apathetic in the way that cartoon populations sometimes are. It is the direct and predictable result of what the contamination has already done to their capacity for that kind of organized response. There is a concept in toxicology called the dose-response relationship. At low doses, certain toxic substances produce effects that are subtle enough to be invisible or easy to explain away. At higher doses, the effects become more pronounced, more recognizable, more clearly connected to the substance causing them. At the highest doses, the effects become catastrophic and rapid. The insidious thing about chronic low-level exposure is that the effects accumulate slowly enough that no single moment seems alarming. The body adjusts, the brain compensates, and by the time the cumulative damage is significant enough to produce clearly recognizable symptoms, the affected person has been living with the gradual deterioration for long enough that the new baseline feels normal. Springfield's residents have been at the chronic low-level exposure stage for decades. The water has been contaminated for as long as most of them have been alive. The air has been irradiated for their entire childhoods. The cognitive damage did not arrive all at once in a way that would have prompted a recognizable crisis. It accumulated, quietly, over years and generations, until the population's current level of cognitive function impaired enough to prevent organized resistance, impaired enough to make critical thinking difficult, impaired enough to make the idea of challenging Burns feel impossible rather than merely difficult, became the town's normal baseline. Nobody in Springfield thinks they are impaired. That is the nature of this kind of damage. The people who have been most affected by it are the people least equipped to recognize that they have been affected. They are not aware of what they are missing because what they are missing is precisely the cognitive capacity that would allow them to perceive the gap. Homer is the clearest example of this, as he is the clearest example of most things in Springfield. When the crayon is removed, when the obstruction is cleared and his full cognitive capacity comes online for the first time, his immediate response is not relief or gratitude. It is disorientation. He has to learn, in a very compressed period, what it feels like to think clearly, and the learning process is painful because it involves simultaneously recognizing how much he has been missing for his entire life. The world looks different with a functioning frontal lobe. The nuclear plant looks different. His job looks different. Burns looks different. The whole architecture of his existence looks different when he can actually see it clearly, and what he sees is something he does not want to know. He chooses to go back. He has the crayon reinserted. He chooses the fog. But the show does not present this as weakness. Exactly. It presents it as a comprehensible response to an unbearable situation. If you could take a pill that would let you see your life with complete clarity, but the clarity revealed that your life had been systematically shaped by forces working against your interests, would you take it? If the pill wore off in a day and you had to return to the fog either way, would the brief clarity be worth the grief it brought? Homer says no. He would rather not know. And in Springfield, that choice is available to him because the fog is always there, maintained by the same plant that created it, refueled by the same water that comes out of every tap, reinforced by the same air that blows down from the cooling towers on a westerly wind. The fog is comfortable. The fog is familiar. The fog is home. And Burns knows this. He has always known this. The single most chilling implication of the radiation theory is not that Burns poisoned a town accidentally. The most chilling implication is that the town's compromised state is not an unfortunate side effect of doing business. It is the product. The irradiation of Springfield's population is not a consequence of running the power plant. The power plant exists, in this reading, partly to produce that irradiation, to maintain that fog, to ensure that the people of Springfield remain exactly cognitively compromised enough to be managed without being so compromised that they cannot function as a workforce. Burns needs workers. He needs customers for his electricity. He needs a town to exploit. A completely incapacitated population would serve none of those purposes, so the contamination is calibrated. The fog is thick enough to prevent organized resistance, but not thick enough to produce mass incapacitation. The 342 violations are not evidence of negligence. They are the maintenance specification. Homer in Sector 7G, half asleep at his console with a donut in his hand and a crayon in his brain, is not an accident of hiring. He is the design. There is one more dimension of the radiation theory that deserves attention before we move on, and it concerns the specific geography of the contamination. The show has established across various episodes that Springfield has a river, a lake, an ocean nearby, and a water table. All of these bodies of water are connected. All of them receive runoff from the power plant's operations. All of them flow through the town and are used by its residents for various purposes. The water cycle in Springfield is completely contained within a region that is entirely within the influence radius of the facility. This matters because water is not the only vector. The irradiation of food sources through contaminated soil and water entering the agricultural supply chain is well established in real-world nuclear contamination studies. Springfield has farms in its surrounding region. Springfield has grocery stores that sell local produce. Springfield has restaurants that source ingredients from regional suppliers. Every link in that food chain passes through the same contaminated environment that the water supply passes through. The air is also a vector. The cracked cooling towers release steam and particulate matter. Wind carries that particulate into residential neighborhoods. Children play outside in it. Adults breathe it during their commutes and their leisure time. The cracked towers are not merely a structural problem, they are delivery mechanisms. And then there is the employment dimension. A significant portion of Springfield's working population works at the plant itself, or in businesses that service the plant, or in commercial enterprises along the routes that plant workers travel. These people receive elevated doses compared to the general population. Homer, who works directly adjacent to an active reactor core, receives an elevated dose compared to his neighbors. The dose-response curve in Springfield is not uniform. Different residents have been exposed to different amounts for different durations. The oldest residents, who have been in Springfield their entire long lives, have accumulated the most. Children who were born in Springfield and have never left have been accumulating since before birth. Their exposure beginning in utero through their mother's compromised biology. What you get when you map this across the population is a spectrum. Some residents have been affected minimally, some have been affected dramatically. Some, like Homer, show extreme cognitive effects with extraordinary physical resilience. Some, like Maggie, show what appears to be cognitive enhancement of some unusual kind. Some, like Molman, show premature aging and apparent biological immortality simultaneously. The radiation does not do the same thing to every person. It does different things to different biologies in different doses over different durations. What it does to everyone in some form is change them. Springfield is not a population of people who happen to look like cartoon characters. Springfield is a population of people who have been altered, each in their own specific way, by the same invisible force that flows through their water and drifts in their air and hums from the plant on the hill. And not a single one of them knows it. Not a single one of them can know it, because the knowing requires the very cognitive capacity that the exposure has most consistently damaged. There is a pattern in the post-coma episodes that is worth examining in detail, because it becomes clearer the more episodes you apply it to. The earliest post-coma seasons, seasons 5, 6, and 7, are generally considered the show's creative peak. They are the seasons fans point to when they defend the show's quality, the seasons that produce the episodes most frequently cited as the best the show has ever done. Mother Simpson, Cape Fear, Homer's Enemy. And the coma theory has an explanation for why these particular seasons feel so different from what comes after, and why even they feel different from what came before. In the early post-coma seasons, Homer's dreaming brain is still largely intact. The damage is recent. The coma has been underway for months, not years. The dream is still drawing on a relatively fresh and coherent set of memories, still generating storylines that feel emotionally true. Because the emotional data underlying them, Homer's real relationships with his family, his real anxieties, his real love is still being accessed with something close to fidelity. The dream gets the family right in these seasons because the memories are recent enough to be accurate. Marge feels like Marge, Bart feels like Bart, Lisa feels like Lisa. The relationships have the right texture because Homer's unconscious mind is working from memories that are only months old rather than years old. The emotional core is intact because the emotional data has not degraded yet. But the brain in a long-term coma does not stabilize. It continues to deteriorate, slowly, as the weeks become months and the months become years. The neural pathways that store and access memories begin to degrade. The emotional data becomes less precise. The dream becomes less accurate as a representation of the actual people in Homer's life, because the model the dream is drawing from is a model of people that Homer has not seen or heard or touched in years, a model that is slowly losing its resolution. By the later seasons, the dream is drawing on a model that has been degraded by years of disconnection. Marge is still there, but she is a lower resolution Marge, a Marge that the dreaming brain is generating from approximations rather than fresh memories. Bart is still there, but the Bart of later seasons lacks some of the emotional specificity of the Bart from seasons 5 and 6, because the memory of Bart has lost some of its precision. This explains the quality decline in a way that is genuinely uncomfortable if you sit with it. The show did not get worse because the writers got lazy. The show got worse, under this theory, because Homer's brain is losing the memory data that was making the dream accurate. The dream is becoming cruder, less precise, more reliant on broad strokes and less capable of the emotional nuance that made the early seasons feel real. And the plots become more outlandish not because the writers ran out of grounded ideas, but because a deteriorating brain generates increasingly incoherent dream content. The early post-coma plots are still recognizable as the kinds of things that could happen to a real family, filtered through satire. The later post-coma plots are the kinds of things that only happen in dreams. Homer traveling to every country, Homer befriending every celebrity, Homer having adventures that no human being could actually have, because no human being is actually having them. Homer's brain is generating them from whole cloth, from fragments of television and radio and overheard conversation, assembled into something that resembles a life more than it resembles reality. The decline of The Simpsons, under this theory, is the decline of Homer's consciousness, and the show has been documenting it faithfully, episode by episode, for 30 years. There is another detail from the original coma episode that deserves attention before we move on, and it is the detail that makes the theory feel most like something the show intended, rather than something fans imposed on it after the fact. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show, and clip shows exist, in the logic of television production, to fill an episode slot with minimal new content by revisiting older material. They are, by definition, episodes about memory. Episodes that exist to look backward at what has already happened, to review and revisit and re-experience events from the show's past. The coma episode, the episode in which Homer enters an unconscious state from which he may never have woken, is a clip show, an episode about memory, an episode built around the revisiting of the past. Homer falls into a coma in the middle of an episode about looking back at what his life has been. If the coma theory is true, that is not a coincidence. It is a structural statement so precise it almost has to be intentional. Homer enters his permanent unconscious state in the middle of an episode about memory, and everything that follows is, in one reading, that memory extended into a dream that stretches forever. The clip show is the last real episode. Everything after it is the dream of a man who was watching his own memories play back when the vending machine fell. The question of who shot Mr. Burns matters beyond its specific narrative function in the show. It matters because of what the handling of the mystery reveals about Springfield's relationship with truth and justice. Burns is shot. The town investigates. And the investigation arrives at an answer that is convenient, legally unprosecutable, and resolves the situation without requiring any serious examination of the actual power structures that produced the shooting in the first place. Nobody asks why the richest man in town was able to block out the sun and face no legal consequences for it. Nobody asks why a billionaire was able to use his financial power to destroy a school, close a bar, collapse a retirement home, and injure a family dog without any regulatory or legal intervention stopping him before he got shot. The shooting is treated as the story. But the shooting was a symptom. The actual story is a system so thoroughly captured by one man's wealth that the only available remedy for a population that had been systematically failed by every institution that should have protected them was a gun in a parking lot. Whether Maggie pulled the trigger or Homer pulled the trigger or Marge pulled the trigger, the question that Springfield never asks is, how did things get to a point where this was the only option left? The answer to that question is the answer to every question in Springfield. Burns did it. Burns created the conditions. Burns bought the government, compromised the regulatory apparatus, maintained his monopoly through institutional corruption so complete that the only recourse available to the population was individual violence. And when the violence happened, the investigation focused on identifying a shooter rather than on examining why the shooter felt a gun was their last option. This is, stripped of its cartoon framing, a fairly precise description of how actual institutional failures tend to be processed by societies that cannot afford to examine their own structural problems. The individual act is investigated. The systemic conditions that produce the individual act are quietly set aside. A conclusion is reached that resolves the immediate situation without threatening the structures that created it, and everyone goes back to normal, which is to say, back to the conditions that made the shooting inevitable in the first place. Maggie takes the blame, Burns recovers. The sun-blocking device is presumably dismantled, though the show does not dwell on this. And by the next episode, everything is more or less back to the way it was before Burns started his scheme, which means Burns still owns the plant, still controls the power supply, still employs Homer, and still presides over a town that has just demonstrated, once again, that it cannot successfully challenge him through any mechanism that actually threatens his position. The shooting changed nothing structural, which is exactly what you would expect from a verdict that identified the shooter as a 1-year-old baby. A baby cannot testify. A baby cannot implicate anyone else. A baby cannot explain the circumstances that led her to a parking lot with a gun. A baby cannot describe what she saw, who else was there, what she witnessed before the trigger was pulled. The identification of Maggie as the shooter produces a closed case that generates no further inquiry, implicates no one else, and requires no examination of anything beyond the immediate act. Convenient, perhaps, for anyone who knows more about the circumstances than they have disclosed. There is also the matter of why Burns had a gun at a public town meeting in the first place. Burns is an elderly man of extreme physical frailty. He has Smithers to manage his physical security. He does not typically carry a weapon personally. But on this particular evening, at this particular meeting, at which his relationship with the entire town had reached a crisis point, Burns arrived armed. Did he know something was going to happen? Was he anticipating a confrontation beyond verbal? Did he bring the gun because he planned to use it on someone, and the evening's events overtook his own intentions before he could act on them? The show does not answer these questions because the show is committed to the Maggie answer, and the Maggie answer does not require them. But they are there. They sit in the episode, unanswered, alongside all the other unanswered questions that stack up in Springfield whenever you start looking closely at the official version of anything. Burns's relationship with Smithers deserves its own extended examination because the dynamic between them is one of the most carefully layered in the show, and it illuminates the immortality question from an angle that does not get enough attention. Smithers has devoted his entire adult life to Burns. This is not a slight exaggeration or a narrative shorthand. It is the literal, documented truth of the character. Smithers does not have meaningful relationships outside of his relationship with Burns. He does not have close friendships among the other residents of Springfield. He does not have romantic partnerships that persist. He does not have hobbies that exist independent of serving Burns's interests. Every dimension of Waylon Smithers' life is organized around the service and protection and sustenance of one specific elderly billionaire. The show has played this for comedy, for pathos, for occasional tragedy, but there is a dimension of it that the show has consistently gestured toward without fully exploring. Smithers knows everything. He knows what the treatments involve. He knows the precise schedule they require. He knows what happens to Burns if a session is missed, because Burns has told him, or because he has witnessed it, or both. Smithers is the keeper of the most dangerous secret in Springfield, not that the plant is contaminated, because that is visible enough for anyone paying attention, but that the man who owns the plant is sustained entirely by artificial intervention and would die within a week without it. That knowledge is power. Real, substantial, irreversible power over a man who has structured his entire empire around the assumption that he is permanent. If Smithers wanted to end Burns, not harm him, not challenge him, simply withdraw the logistical support that keeps him alive and do nothing else, he could. He knows the schedule. He controls the calendar, he manages the appointments. He could quietly move a session, reschedule it by a week, fail to arrange the transport, and Burns would simply deteriorate and die without anyone being able to directly attribute the death to Smithers' action. The show has never directly addressed why Smithers does not exercise this power. The standard reading is that Smithers' devotion is genuine enough to override any resentment he might feel toward Burns' frequent cruelty, dismissal, and exploitation of his loyalty. That might be true. Smithers' emotional connection to Burns is depicted as sincere, even when it is clearly unrequited. But there is another reading. Smithers does not withdraw the treatments because Smithers does not actually want Burns to die. Not because he loves Burns too much, though he does, because Smithers knows what comes after Burns dies. When Burns is gone, the Empire requires a successor. The medical protocol requires someone who understands it and can maintain it. The power plant requires an owner with the resources to keep the violations from being prosecuted. All of it requires someone in the position that Burns currently occupies. And there is, in the show's broader implication, a possibility that Smithers has considered, that the logical successor to Burns is Smithers himself. That Smithers has been learning, over decades of intimate proximity to the most sophisticated medical life extension program in Springfield, how to manage the treatments. That Smithers knows, because he has had to know, what the protocol involves and how it works. If Burns' immortality is technological rather than supernatural, if it is a regime of treatments that anyone with sufficient resources and medical knowledge could theoretically access, then proximity to Burns has given Smithers something more valuable than loyalty. It has given him the knowledge of how to stay alive indefinitely, if he ever acquires the resources to apply it. Smithers is not simply devoted to Burns. In one reading, Smithers is apprenticing to replace him. He is learning the technology of immortality by being the person responsible for administering it. And the devotion, the genuine emotional attachment, does not contradict this. Both things can be true simultaneously. Smithers can love Burns and also be the person who inherits what Burns knows, which raises the question of what Springfield would look like under a Smithers administration, which is perhaps the darkest possible extrapolation this theory produces. Burns at least has the clarity of being explicitly villainous. He is comprehensibly corrupt in ways that the town can at least name, even if it cannot effectively resist them. Smithers, who has all of Burns' institutional knowledge and none of Burns' transparent self-interest, might be a more challenging figure entirely. But that is speculation beyond what the show has established. What the show has established is the dynamic between them, the dependency that runs in both directions. Burns' biological dependency on Smithers, and Smithers' emotional and occupational dependency on Burns, and the extraordinary stasis that dependency produces. Neither of them can afford for the other to leave. Neither of them can afford for the arrangement to change. So the arrangement continues, year after year, decade after decade, a closed loop between two people who are each, in their own way, as trapped as everyone else in Springfield. There is a specific moment in the show's run, easy to miss if you are not looking for it, where Maggie's strategic intelligence becomes undeniable in a way that cannot be explained by coincidence or developmental luck. The moment comes in an episode where the family is in genuine danger. The exact episode varies depending on which version of this analysis you are reading, because the show has produced multiple instances of this pattern. The pattern is, the family is in a situation that the adults cannot resolve. Homer is incapacitated in some way or panicking or doing the wrong thing with great confidence. Marge is managing other dimensions of the crisis. Bart and Lisa are doing what they can, which is sometimes useful and sometimes making things worse. And Maggie, in the background of the scene, unobserved by the adults and largely unacknowledged by the narrative, quietly does the thing that actually resolves the situation. She does not do it dramatically, she does not announce it, she does not wait for anyone to notice or thank her. She does what needs to be done and then returns to the passive, pacifier-sucking, unassuming posture of a baby who has nothing to contribute to what is happening around her. The show frames these moments as comedy beats the cutaway to Maggie resolving a crisis that the adults have been failing to resolve is a gag, a punchline, a punctuation mark on the episode's chaos. But the gag only works because Maggie's intervention is actual, within the logic of the scene. She really does fix the thing. The comedy is not that she tried and failed adorably. The comedy is that she succeeded where the adults failed and nobody noticed. Over 36 years, those moments accumulate into a portrait of someone who has been paying very close attention to how the world around her works, who has developed a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect and human behavior and physical mechanics, and who has chosen to deploy that understanding selectively, sparingly, only when the stakes require it, and always in ways that go unobserved. The question that haunts this is not what Maggie has done. It is what Maggie has decided not to do. Every time she intervenes in a crisis, she is also, by implication, cataloging the crises she has decided not to intervene in. Every situation she resolves is surrounded by situations she assessed and chose to let play out on their own. She is not responding reflexively. She is making judgments, evaluating situations, deciding when her intervention is worth the cost of revealing that she is capable of intervening. That is not a baby. That is a strategist. And a strategist who has been operating in Springfield for 36 years, watching every player, understanding every dynamic, mapping every relationship and every power structure and every vulnerability. That is a very specific kind of danger. Not the obvious danger of someone who announces their capabilities and demands recognition. The subtler danger of someone who knows more than anyone around them suspects, who has been building a picture of the board for decades, and who has not yet revealed what they intend to do with that picture. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She has been watching, from that position, while Burns built his empire and maintained his monopoly and kept the town in a fog and drove families apart and sustained himself through treatments that let him outlive anyone who might challenge him. She has been watching while Homer worked for the man who destroyed his family without understanding the connection. She has been watching while the town voted to sustain lies and exile truths and reset after every catastrophe and go back to normal as though normal was not the problem. She has been watching all of it, and she has not spoken. There is a secondary conspiracy embedded in the Mona Simpson story that the show introduces and then quietly drops, and it involves the biological weapons laboratory in a way that extends beyond Mona's activism. Burns owned the laboratory. This is established clearly. Burns was manufacturing biological weapons within the borders of Springfield, in a facility that Mona and her group destroyed. The destruction of that facility is what makes Mona a fugitive. But the show never adequately addresses what happened to the research, the equipment, the scientific personnel, and the institutional knowledge that the laboratory contained before Mona's group detonated their antibiotic bomb. The bomb destroyed the biological agents, but it is not clear that it destroyed the facility itself, the personnel, or the research documents. And Burns, having had the laboratory destroyed, had every motivation to rebuild it elsewhere, under deeper cover, more thoroughly insulated from activist intervention. Under this reading, the nuclear power plant is not Burns's primary operation. It is his public operation. It is the thing Springfield knows about, the thing that generates the visible contamination that the town has been trained to normalize, the thing that explains the glowing fish and the cracked cooling towers and the radiation treatments. But behind it, drawing on the resources that the plant generates, there may be a second operation, one that did not stop because Mona's group threw a bomb at the first version of it. The show does not develop this implication. It introduces Burns as the owner of a biological weapons laboratory, uses that fact to explain Mona's activism and subsequent fugitive status, and then moves on to other things. But the fact sits in the show's canon. Burns owned a germ warfare facility. That facility was destroyed. Burns continued to operate in Springfield afterward, with full resources and no apparent diminishment of his capacity to pursue his interests. For decades, what was he doing in that time? What is he still doing? The radiation theory focuses on the nuclear plant as the mechanism of Springfield's contamination, but the existence of the biological weapons laboratory suggests that the contamination may not be purely nuclear. The town's unusual biology, the mutations, the immunological anomalies, the extraordinary disease profiles might be the result of overlapping exposures. Radioactive contamination from the plant, combined with residual biological contamination from the laboratory, producing effects that neither source alone would have generated. This is speculation, not established canon, but it is speculation that the show's own established facts support, and it adds a layer of darkness to the Burns mythology that the show has consistently been willing to gesture toward without fully illuminating. Burns is not just a corrupt industrialist running a dangerous power plant. Burns is, or was, a weapons manufacturer who relocated his weapons operation after its first iteration was destroyed, who has been operating in Springfield for decades with resources and infrastructure that the visible, above-ground power plant does not fully account for. What is in those basements? The ones with the human skeletons? The show does not say. It shows you the bones and moves on. But it showed you the biological weapons laboratory first, and the bones are in the basement of the facility that operates under the same ownership as the destroyed laboratory. And the owner has been alive for well over a century, sustained by treatments that the show has never fully explained, maintaining a pharmaceutical infrastructure that the visible narrative of running a nuclear plant does not require. Whatever is in those basements, it has been there for a long time, and it has company. The Principal and the Pauper episode also illuminates something about the show's relationship with its own audience that is rarely discussed directly. When the episode aired in 1997, the fan backlash was immediate and, by the standards of a pre-social media era, intense. Message boards and early internet forums filled with complaints. Critics wrote unfavorable reviews. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner and has a genuine personal investment in the character, expressed his displeasure publicly in a way that writers and showrunners noticed. The show absorbed this feedback, and its response to it, in subsequent seasons, was not to apologize for the episode or to walk it back. Its response was to simply not engage with it. Skinner continued to appear as Skinner, the Tamzarian revelation was not referenced, and the show behaved as though the episode had never happened, which was precisely what the episode had been about. The town of Springfield voted to pretend the truth had never been established, and then the show itself voted to do the same, which means the show's production team enacted the exact dynamic the episode depicted. The uncomfortable truth was introduced. The audience rejected it, and the response was to officially, communally decide that the truth would not be acknowledged going forward. Anyone who brought it up would find themselves talking to a wall. The canon had been adjusted by collective agreement, and the adjustment was permanent. This is the most meta moment in the show's 36-year run. Not the predictions that came true, not the theories that the writers responded to, the actual structural event in which the show's production apparatus responded to fan pressure by doing, in real life, exactly what Springfield had done in fiction. They voted to forget. They exiled the truth of the episode from the ongoing canon by simply not referencing it. And the fans, who had demanded the forgetting, got what they wanted. The lie was sustained. The real Seymour Skinner was removed, and Armin Tamzarian walked back into Springfield Elementary as though none of it had happened. The show is not separate from Springfield. The show is Springfield. There is a final dimension of the prediction phenomenon that sits underneath the statistical probability argument and the confirmation bias argument and the intelligent writers extrapolating trends argument, and it is genuinely uncomfortable to articulate even for people who are fully committed to the rational explanation for everything else on this list. It is the dimension of intent. The Simpsons writing staff at its peak was not just intelligent and well-educated. It was, in the assessment of many people who worked alongside it, genuinely extraordinary. The combination of academic credentials, creative range, analytical sharpness, and cultural fluency that the room contained during the show's golden era was unusual even by the standard of elite television writing rooms. These were people who had spent years training themselves to see patterns, to extrapolate trajectories, to identify the places where current trends were heading before those trends had fully arrived. And they were doing this in a comedy room, in an environment where the job was to find what was funny about those trajectories, what was absurd, what the joke was. The joke almost always requires identifying the most extreme version of a trend, the place where it ends up if nothing interrupts it, the conclusion that is simultaneously inevitable and ridiculous. Finding that conclusion requires seeing the trajectory clearly, and seeing the trajectory clearly seeing where things are actually going, stripped of the optimistic or fearful projections that most people apply to current events, is, functionally, a form of prediction. Not mystical prediction, not time travel, just the ability to see what is already in motion and project it forward without flinching from where it leads. The Trump prediction works this way. The writers saw a celebrity businessman with genuine political ambitions and a media persona carefully calibrated for maximum attention, saw the cultural machinery already in motion that was making celebrity a viable substitute for political experience, and projected the trajectory to its logical endpoint. They were right, not because they were prophets, because they were honest about where the line was pointing. Most people in 2000 could not hold that trajectory clearly enough to see the endpoint. They filtered it through assumptions about what the political system would and would not allow. They assumed corrections would occur. They assumed the trajectory would bend before it reached that conclusion. The writers did not make those assumptions. They drew the line to where it went. And that is the thing about the predictions that is actually worth thinking about. Not that the show foresaw the future, but that the show consistently refused to look away from where things were heading, and was right about the direction more often than comfortable. The show has never been wrong about the direction, only about the speed. The Springfield location mystery has produced some of the most detailed and creative fan analyses in the show's history, and it is worth spending some time with the most serious attempts because what they reveal about the methodology of the investigation is as interesting as what they reveal about the town. The most systematic approach to locating Springfield attempts to use every piece of geographic information the show has ever provided and build a constraint, set a list of requirements that the real state must satisfy. Simultaneously, Springfield has mountains. Springfield has a coastline. Springfield has a desert nearby. Springfield borders certain other states. Springfield has a specific climate profile that produces the weather the show depicts. Springfield has a specific economic profile consistent with being a mid-sized industrial town. Springfield's area code, briefly visible in certain episodes, begins with specific digits. When you compile all these constraints and try to find a state that satisfies all of them, you find that no state does. The constraints are mutually exclusive in aggregate. You can find states that satisfy most of them. You can find states that satisfy all the geographic ones, or all the cultural ones, or all the climatic ones. But no state satisfies all of them simultaneously, because the show has introduced contradictory information at different points that cannot be reconciled into a single consistent geography. This is not an accident of production carelessness. The show has been running long enough, and has had enough writers with enough geographic knowledge, that a genuine accidentally inconsistent geography would have been corrected at some point. The contradictions persist because they are deliberate. The writers have been actively maintaining the geographic impossibility by introducing new contradictions whenever an episode threatens to narrow the field too much. The most famous attempt to resolve the location question came from a fan who spent several years compiling every geographic reference in every episode and building a comprehensive constraint map. This person concluded, after exhaustive analysis, that the show was most consistent with a location in the northeastern United States, probably in a state that borders both Canada and the Atlantic, with the cultural inflections of a post-industrial town in that region. The Springfield, Vermont hypothesis was popular for a period, based on this analysis and on various cultural clues in the early seasons that seemed to point toward New England. The show promptly aired an episode that placed Springfield in a geographic context completely inconsistent with Vermont, and the hypothesis collapsed. The fan tried again with adjusted parameters. The show aired another contradictory episode. This has been the rhythm of the location investigation for 36 years. A careful analyst narrows the field. The show opens it back up. A new candidate emerges. The show introduces a counterexample. The location remains undetermined. It is almost like the show is aware of the investigation and is responding to it, which it is. The writers watch fan discourse. They know what theories are circulating. They know when the community feels close to an answer. And they have demonstrated, repeatedly, that their preferred response to a location theory gaining traction is to produce an episode that makes the theory untenable. Not out of cruelty, out of the same instinct that drives every other aspect of Springfield's geographic impossibility. The location mystery is one of the show's most valuable assets. It generates engagement. It sustains interest. It gives fans something to investigate across the entire run of the show, without the investigation ever reaching a conclusion that would end the conversation. The mystery is the product. The mystery has always been the product. And the show will protect that product by any creative means necessary for as long as it continues to run. The floating timeline creates one specific kind of impossibility that does not get enough attention, and it is one that reveals something about the show's relationship with its own emotional core in a way that no other structural feature of the show does. The show has depicted the future, not just in Lisa's wedding, which is the most famous example. It has depicted the future in Bart to the Future, in the various Treehouse of Horror flash-forward segments, in episodes that project the characters into various possible versions of their adult lives. And in every one of these projected futures, the same thing is true. The adult Simpsons are not happy, not catastrophically unhappy, not living in ruins. But the various futures the show has imagined for Bart and Lisa and Maggie are futures defined by the specific weight of lives that did not quite become what they might have been. Lisa becomes a politician or an academic, and she is isolated by her intelligence in the same way she was isolated as a child, just in adult contexts. Bart becomes various things depending on the episode, but he is always somehow adrift, searching for the same validation he was searching for at 10. Maggie is rarely depicted, which is its own kind of commentary. The futures are realistic in the specific way that futures tend to be realistic. The fundamental character is continuous. The person who was lonely at 8 is lonely at 30. The person who was searching at 10 is searching at 35. The childhood self persists into the adult self in ways that are recognizable, and the show has always been honest about this when it chooses to look at it directly. Which might be why the show chooses not to look at it most of the time. The floating timeline does not just protect the Simpson family from aging, it protects them from their own futures. If Bart is always 10, Bart never becomes the version of himself that the show's own flash-forwards suggest he is heading toward. The permanent childhood is not just an absence of aging, it is an absence of consequence. The choices that define an adult life have not yet been made. The character has not yet hardened into its final shape. Everything is still possible, or at least everything feels like it might be possible, because the moment of closing off possibilities through the accumulated weight of choices made has not yet arrived. That is what we are protecting when we protect the floating timeline. Not just the youth of the characters, the potential of them, the version of them where things might still turn out differently than the glimpsed futures suggest. The show has always known what its characters are heading toward. It just refuses to arrive there, because arriving there means admitting that the potential has finally been spent, that the choices have been made, that the futures have crystallized into the people these characters were always going to become. As long as Bart is 10, he has not yet become whatever Bart eventually becomes. As long as Lisa is 8, she has not yet arrived at the specific form of loneliness that awaits her. As long as Maggie is 1, the question of what Maggie will do with her extraordinary capabilities remains genuinely open. The floating timeline is a mercy, for the characters and for the audience, a stay of execution against the moment when the potential becomes the actual, and we have to look at what the actual is. There is a character we have not spent enough time on, and that omission is itself part of the story. Marge Simpson is the most consistently underestimated person in Springfield, and possibly in the entire history of the show's fan discourse, and the gap between what the show gives her and what she deserves reveals something important about the show's own blind spots. Marge holds everything together. This is a description rather than a metaphor. Without Marge's continuous, active, largely unacknowledged labor, the Simpson family does not function. Homer's disasters require cleanup. Bart's provocations require management. Lisa's emotional crises require witnessing and support. Maggie requires the constant supervision that an infant requires. The household requires cooking and cleaning and scheduling and financial management and 100 other practical tasks that the show occasionally acknowledges and more often simply assumes happen. Marge does all of this for 36 years, without recognition commensurate with the labor involved. The show has, on various occasions, attempted to give Marge storylines of her own, episodes in which she pursues painting or real estate or various other interests, episodes in which she confronts Homer's failures in ways that suggest she might actually leave, episodes in which her own desires and frustrations are the center of the narrative rather than the support structure for someone else's narrative. These episodes are almost universally resolved by Marge returning to the center, to the house, to the role, to the work that she does without acknowledgement in the background of every episode that is ostensibly about someone else. The show has never quite reckoned with what this means. It has gestured at it. There are episodes where the camera lingers on Marge in a moment of quiet exhaustion, where the writing acknowledges the weight of what she carries. But the acknowledgement is always temporary. By the next episode, the weight has been set down and picked back up, and the show has returned to treating it as simply the natural condition of Marge's life. Under the radiation theory, Marge's steadiness is a symptom. The same contamination that suppresses Homer's cognition and amplifies Maggie's has done something specific to Marge. It has calcified her capacity for disruption. Her patience is not entirely a character trait. It is a biology. The systems in her brain that would generate the kind of decisive, permanent action actually forcing a fundamental change in the family structure are functioning at a lower level than they should be. Under the coma theory, Marge's steadiness is Homer's most fundamental need. The coma dream, generated by a man who is terrified of abandonment, has made Marge essentially unable to leave. The Marge of the dream is built from Homer's need for her to stay, which means she is, almost literally, constitutionally incapable of the kind of departure that the real Marge may have already made while Homer lies unconscious in the hospital. Under both theories, Marge's patience is not a virtue the character has chosen. It is something that has been done to her. And the show, which loves Marge, has never quite confronted this. What the show has consistently gotten right about Marge is the love. Whatever the mechanism that keeps her in place, the love is real. Not just within the show's narrative, but in how the show treats her. Marge is drawn with more care than any other character. Her emotional responses are more precisely rendered. Her moments of genuine connection with the family, the quiet ones, the ones that happen in the background of scenes about other things, are the emotional anchors of the show's 36-year run. If Homer is what the show is about at the plot level, Marge is what the show is about at the emotional level. She is the thing that gives the loop its warmth. She is the reason it is worth going back. And she has never been given enough credit for that. Not by the show, not by the fan discourse, not by the theories that spend pages on Homer's brain damage and Burns's immortality and Maggie's strategic silence. Marge is the gravity that keeps Springfield from flying apart, and she has been doing it for 36 years, while everyone else, including the people making the show and the people theorizing about it, mostly look the other way. There is a reason that all of these theories, despite coming from different starting points and using different evidence and arriving at their conclusions through different routes, end up feeling like they are describing the same thing. They are. The radiation theory, the coma theory, the denial theory, the immortality theory, these are not competing explanations for what Springfield is. They are complementary descriptions of what a town looks like when power goes completely unchecked for long enough. Burns owns the power plant. Burns owns the water supply, because the plant contaminates it and nobody has successfully forced remediation. Burns owns the economic infrastructure, because his monopoly on electricity means his monopoly on the basic operational requirements of every business in town. Burns owns the political apparatus, because his wealth long since captured every official who might have challenged him. Burns owns the medical establishment, because his influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure he depends on to keep himself alive. What Burns does not own is the population's attention. He does not need to. The attention problem solves itself. A cognitively impaired population does not pay sustained attention to the mechanisms of its own exploitation. A population with compromised memory function does not effectively accumulate grievances across events. A population governed by collective denial does not build the kind of shared understanding of systemic problems that organized resistance requires. Springfield is the end state of unchecked power. Not in the dramatic dystopian sense. There are no surveillance drones, no uniformed enforcers, no visible apparatus of control. It is something quieter and more durable than that. The control is invisible because it operates through damage rather than force, through contamination rather than coercion, through the slow, continuous degradation of the capacities that would allow resistance rather than the dramatic suppression of resistance when it emerges. Real tyranny rarely announces itself. It mostly just makes it harder and harder to think clearly, remember accurately, organize effectively, sustain the kind of long-range reasoning that coordinated challenge requires. And it keeps the lights on while it does this. It keeps the electricity flowing and the jobs available and the economy functional enough that the cost of disruption seems higher than the cost of continuing. That is Springfield. That is what 36 years of the show has been carefully, lovingly, hilariously depicting. Not as a polemic, not as a message, just as a reflection. An enormously detailed, enormously funny, enormously sad reflection of a specific kind of American community. A kind that exists and has always existed and is recognized immediately by anyone who has spent time in it. The theories are true, all of them. Not as literal facts about a cartoon, they are obviously not that, but as interpretive frameworks for understanding what the show is saying about the world it is describing. And what the show is saying, in every theory, through every mystery, across every impossible event in 36 years of Springfield is this. This is what it costs to keep the lights on. This is what you give up. Your health, your memory, your cognitive clarity, your mother, your potential, your ability to see what has been done to you, your capacity to ask why. This is what the lights cost. And Springfield keeps paying it. Episode after episode, season after season. The bill comes due, and Springfield pays it and forgets it paid it, and the lights stay on, and the plant keeps running, and Burns keeps his weekly appointment, and Homer keeps showing up to Sector 7G, and nobody asks why the fish have 3 eyes. Because the lights are on, and the lights being on is everything. The theories end here. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything that is left to say comes back to this. The light that Springfield pays for, with its health and its history and its capacity to know itself, that is the light that Homer comes home to, every episode, after everything goes wrong and gets fixed and goes wrong again. The warm light of a house on Evergreen Terrace where his family is waiting. The light that makes the bill worth paying, even though Homer does not know he is paying it, even though the cost is things he will never get to name. The light is worth it. That is why the show cannot end. That is why we cannot let it end. Because the light going out means admitting what the light cost, and we are not ready to do that. We may never be ready. One of the details about the power plant that the show introduces and never returns to in any sustained way is the nature of the water supply itself. Springfield has a river. It has a lake. It presumably has a municipal water system that draws from one or both of those sources. And the show has established clearly that radioactive waste has been dumped directly into local waterways at the facility level. Real-world nuclear contamination studies tell us that the most dangerous long-term exposure pathway for populations living near nuclear facilities is often not air or direct radiation, but waterborne contamination that enters the body through drinking water and the food supply. The half-lives of certain radioactive isotopes mean that contamination introduced into a waterway decades ago is still measurable today, still bioaccumulating in fish and other organisms that live in that water, still entering human bodies through consumption. Springfield's Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is not just a sight gag. Blinky is a biomarker. A three-eyed fish is a fish in which the radiation has produced a visible developmental abnormality. Visible abnormalities represent the severe end of a contamination effect distribution. For every fish that grows a third eye, there are hundreds that suffer less visible but still significant developmental damage, organ abnormalities, metabolic disruption, neurological effects that do not produce a third eye, but produce a dozen other problems that would not be immediately noticeable without close study. And below the fish, in the food chain, are smaller organisms absorbing the contamination at higher concentrations. And above the fish, in the food chain, are the people eating the fish. Or not eating the fish from the river directly, but eating food grown in soil irrigated by river water, or consuming dairy from cattle that graze on river-adjacent land, or drinking water drawn from a municipal system that sources from the contaminated watershed. The bioaccumulation chain in Springfield is complete. Every trophic level above the contaminated water source is receiving a dose proportional to its position in that chain. And the population at the top of that chain, the people of Springfield, who have been consuming from this system for their entire lives, has received the highest cumulative dose of anyone in the system. Burns knows this. The plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk, the show introduces this detail with perfect comic casualness, is not just evidence of reckless workplace safety. It is evidence that the facility treats radioactive material as so normalized, so thoroughly integrated into the daily operations of the plant, that it does not register as dangerous. When plutonium is a paperweight, the culture of the facility has long since lost its connection to the hazard the material represents, which means the culture of safety that should be preventing routine exposure events, spillage, contamination of surfaces, casual handling without proper protection is functionally absent. People work in that facility every day. They eat lunch there, they touch surfaces, they breathe the air in rooms where radioactive materials have been handled carelessly for years. They go home, carrying trace amounts of contamination on their clothes and their skin and in their lungs, and they bring it into their homes and into the cars they drive and into the restaurants they eat at and into the lives they live outside the plant. Homer is not just exposed at his workstation. Homer is a vector. Every person Homer interacts with outside the plant receives, in some small way, the contamination he carries out of the facility every day. The spread is not dramatic, it is not visible, but it is continuous. And in a town of 30,000 people living in close proximity to each other and to the facility, continuity matters more than drama. The radiation theory is not claiming that Springfield's residents are acutely ill from obvious radiation sickness. It is claiming something subtler and more insidious, that decades of low-level chronic exposure through multiple pathways at different doses for different individuals has produced a population that is measurably different from what it would have been without that exposure. Different biologically, different cognitively, different in ways that have become the new normal for Springfield because the population has never known anything else, and because the one man who understands what has happened has spent a century ensuring that nobody else does. There is a question about the coma theory that is worth addressing directly because it comes up whenever the theory is discussed in depth. If Homer is in a coma, who is generating the dream? This sounds like a philosophical question about the nature of consciousness, but it is actually a question about the theory's internal consistency. If the coma theory is true, then The Simpsons is, in one reading, a documentary about the inner life of an unconscious man. The characters are not real in the way they appear to be real. The events are not real in the way they appear to be real. Everything is filtered through the specific, limited, deteriorating perspective of someone who cannot actually access the world he is dreaming about. This means the dream Homer cannot be fully trusted as a narrator. He knows only what his stored memories contain and what ambient information is reaching him from outside. His understanding of his own family, Marge's inner life, Bart's genuine emotional experience, Lisa's actual needs is a reconstruction based on what he observed before the coma, supplemented by whatever he has absorbed from the hospital room afterward. The Marge in the dream is Homer's model of Marge. The Bart in the dream is Homer's model of Bart. These models are based on love and long observation, but they are necessarily incomplete, necessarily shaped by Homer's own perspective, necessarily lacking whatever has changed about these people in the years since April 1993 that Homer has not been present to witness. This gives every character in the post-coma episodes a slightly uncanny quality when you look for it. They are recognizably the people from before the coma, but they are also Homer's interpretation of those people. Homer's dream of Marge is Marge seen entirely through Homer's love for her, which means Marge in the dream is more patient, more forgiving, more continuously devoted than the real Marge in the hospital room might actually be. The dream Marge is the Marge Homer needs, not necessarily the Marge who exists. The same is true of Bart. The dream Bart is perpetually 10 years old, perpetually mischievous but ultimately loving, perpetually reachable through the right combination of patience and direct appeal. This is Homer's hope for his son. The real Bart, growing up in the waking world without his father present, may have become something quite different. The dream is not updated by new information about who Bart is actually becoming, because Homer cannot access new information. The dream Bart is frozen at the version of Bart that Homer carries in his memory. This is the coma theory's most emotionally precise implication. Not that Homer is dreaming, but that the people in his dream are increasingly approximations. Each season that passes, each year in the coma, each episode that airs, brings Homer a little further from the actual people his dream characters are based on. The gap between Dream Marge and Real Marge, between Dream Bart and Real Bart, between Dream Lisa and Real Lisa, grows with every year Homer spends unconscious. The dream keeps the family together, but the family it keeps together is a family of memories, not people. And memories, without new experience to update them, gradually lose their resolution. They become softer, less specific, more general. The people in Homer's dream are becoming more archetypal and less particular with every passing season, and what reads in the show as declining character writing is, under this theory, a faithful depiction of exactly that process. Homer's dream is losing its grip on who his family actually is, and the tragedy is that he cannot know this, because knowing it would require accessing the very information his coma prevents him from reaching. The historical span that Burns claims direct personal experience of is worth mapping in detail, because the accumulation of it tells you something about what the show is actually saying about him. Burns has personal memories of the Gilded Age, not as received history, not as something he read about or was taught, but as lived experience. He has referenced the business practices and social dynamics of the late 1800s, American economic elite, in ways that suggest familiarity, the kind of casual familiarity that comes from having been present in that world rather than from studying it afterward. He attended Yale, which the show places in a period consistent with the early 20th century. Yale has been accepting undergraduates since 1701, but the Yale experience Burns references has the specific texture of the Progressive Era, the period between roughly 1900 and 920, when the university was a particular kind of institution, producing a particular kind of elite. The social dynamics, the specific cultural references, the way Burns describes his peer group from that period, all of it places him as a young man in those decades. He served in World War II. The show depicts this directly and with some specificity. Burns's role in the war, as the show has constructed it, was morally complicated at minimum and potentially criminal, involving the theft of a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war years. This is Burns at middle age, in the 1940s, already possessing the full set of his adult capabilities and the ruthlessness that defines his character. He is not a young man in this period. He is the man we recognize. He knew Howard Hughes. Hughes died in 1976, and by Burns's account, their relationship extended over a significant period. This places Burns's active social life well into the second half of the 20th century. And then there is the present. Burns in the show's contemporary episodes, running his plant, managing his medical treatments, scheming against Springfield's interests with the same focused, cold intelligence he has always brought to his schemes. The span from the Gilded Age to the present is well over 100 years. No human being in recorded history has lived that long while remaining cognitively functional. The maximum confirmed human lifespan is currently 122 years, and the person who achieved that lifespan was not running a multinational corporation in her final decades. Burns, by the show's own continuity, has been not merely alive but actively, cognitively dominant for a period that exceeds what is biologically possible for an unassisted human being. This is why the treatment is not optional. Burns is not receiving the weekly radiation therapy as a luxury or as a precaution. He is receiving it because without it, the accumulated biological debt of a century and a half of existence would come due all at once. The treatments are not extending his life so much as they are deferring the bill. The biological cost of all those years has not been paid. It is being rolled over, week by week, through the controlled administration of whatever the treatments contain. And like any debt that is only ever rolled over and never actually reduced, the underlying obligation only grows. The day Burns misses a treatment is the day 140 years of biological time arrive simultaneously, which is why Smithers never misses a day of work. The final thing worth saying about Springfield is the thing that is hardest to say, because it requires acknowledging something that the theories, for all their detail and rigor, have been dancing around. The show is not just about Springfield. The show is about watching Springfield, about the specific experience of returning, week after week, to the same place and the same people, and finding that everything is exactly as you left it. The same house, the same couch, the same family, the same loop. There is a comfort in that return that is hard to explain to someone who has not felt it. It is not just nostalgia, though nostalgia is part of it. It is something more specific. The experience of a world that does not change when you are not looking. Of people who are always where you left them. Of a family that is always, at the end of every episode, still intact and still together. We do not have that in our own lives. People change. People leave. Children grow up and become someone you did not quite expect. Parents age and become someone you have to take care of rather than someone who takes care of you. The world moves, constantly, in ways that require continuous adjustment, continuous updating of the models you hold of the people you love. Springfield does not require that adjustment. The Simpsons do not change. You can leave for a decade and come back and Homer is still Homer, and Marge is still Marge, and Bart is still 10. The world you return to is exactly the world you left. That is not a small thing. For people whose actual world keeps changing in ways they did not choose, that constancy is genuinely meaningful. It is a place you can always go back to. It is a family you can always visit. It is a home that does not become someone else's house. The theories explain why Springfield cannot change, but they do not explain why we watch. And the answer to that second question is simpler than any of the theories, and more honest, and ultimately more illuminating about what the show actually is. We watch because we need somewhere that does not change. We watch because the Simpsons are there when we get back. We watch because 36 years is long enough to make a place real, and real places are hard to leave. Springfield is real, not in the sense that you can drive there, but in the sense that matters more. It is a place that has been vividly, specifically, lovingly inhabited for long enough to feel lived in. Long enough to carry the weight of actual history. Long enough to have the texture of a world rather than a set. And worlds you have inhabited do not disappear when you stop visiting them. They wait, patient, unchanging, exactly as you left them, with the lights on and the family home and the plant on the hill still running, still leaking, still keeping everyone in the gentle fog that makes the loop possible and makes the return inevitable. That is the final theory, the one that contains all the others. Springfield exists because we keep going back, and we keep going back because Springfield is one of the only places that will always be there when we do. The contrast between Maggie and Lisa is worth examining in more depth, because it is one of the show's most carefully constructed and least explicitly discussed structural elements. Lisa is the family's visible genius. She announces herself. She enters rooms prepared to demonstrate her intelligence and her knowledge and her commitment to whatever cause she has most recently identified as requiring her attention. She argues, she challenges, she corrects, she cites sources and draws conclusions and makes the case for positions that nobody around her wants to hear, and she makes it loudly and persistently and with a confidence in the correctness of her views that sometimes tips over into righteousness. This approach has not served her well. Every episode in which Lisa's intelligence is the central fact of the plot is, at some level, an episode about the limits of intelligence as a social strategy. She is right, almost always. She is wrong sometimes, and the episodes that depict her being wrong are the ones that treat her most kindly, because they allow her the dignity of being human rather than just correct. But even when she is right, the outcome rarely reflects that rightness. The world around her does not adjust to accommodate the accuracy of her positions. It simply continues operating according to its own logic, in which Lisa's intelligence is, at best, a minor inconvenience and, at worst, a provocation. The town has immunized itself against Lisa. It has been exposed to her truth-telling for long enough to have developed a response to it. When Lisa speaks up about something, Springfield already knows how to not listen. The defense mechanisms are in place. The pattern is established. Lisa speaks and the room sighs and waits for her to finish and then does what it was going to do anyway. Maggie has observed this for 36 years. She has watched her sister deploy intelligence as a direct, confrontational force, and she has watched the results. And she has drawn the conclusion that any sufficiently intelligent person, watching that dynamic play out repeatedly over years, would eventually draw. Direct deployment of intelligence in a system that has immunized itself against intelligence is not a strategy, it is a reflex. And reflexes are predictable. Predictable things can be managed, can be dismissed, can be routed around. Maggie does not have reflexes. She has strategies. The silence is the first and most important strategy, because it removes Maggie from the category of things that Springfield has to manage. A speaking child is a child who can be argued with, can be dismissed, can be told to be quiet and sent to their room. A silent baby is a baby. Babies do not require management. Babies are managed by default, automatically, as a matter of routine, in ways that do not require the adults around them to pay active attention. The management of Maggie is so automatic that it has become invisible. She is cared for without being watched. She is present without being seen. That is an extraordinary position to occupy. It is the position of someone who has complete access to every conversation, every decision, every emotional moment in the family's life, without anyone filtering what they say or do in her presence. Adults do not moderate themselves around babies the way they moderate themselves around children who understand them. They assume the baby does not comprehend. They assume the baby is not paying attention. They treat the baby as a kind of warm furniture, present but not absorbing. Maggie absorbs everything. 36 years of unfiltered access to the family's life, to the town's dynamics, to every conversation that takes place in rooms where a baby was assumed to not be listening, to the things adults say when they believe no competent observer is present. Whatever Maggie has learned in that time, whatever picture of Springfield she has assembled from 3.5 decades of unguarded access to it, is almost certainly more complete and more accurate than anything any other character on the show possesses. She knows where the bodies are, possibly literally, given the basements at the power plant, and she has not yet decided what to do with any of it. That patience, that extraordinary, decades-long willingness to observe and accumulate and wait is either the most disciplined strategic behavior in the show's history, or it is the patience of someone who understands that the moment has not yet arrived. Who knows that the right time to act is not now, and is content to keep watching until it is. Either reading is remarkable. Either reading suggests that when Maggie finally acts, if she ever does, the result will be something that Springfield, in its fog and its denial and its radiation-compromised cognition, will not see coming. Because she has been preparing for it since the day she was born. And nobody has noticed. There is a dimension of Burns's control over Springfield that rarely gets discussed in the fan theories, and it is the most mundane and therefore the most invisible. The economic dimension. Burns owns the power plant. The power plant employs a significant portion of Springfield's working population directly. Homer works there. Many of Homer's neighbors work there. Many of the people who shop at Apu's Quickie Mart, who eat at Moe's Tavern, who send their children to Springfield Elementary, they work at the plant. Their paychecks come from Burns. Their mortgage payments, their grocery bills, their car payments, their children's school supplies, all of it traces back, through one degree of separation, to the salary that Burns pays them. This creates an economic dependency that is structurally identical to the dependency of a company town. A company town is a community in which a single employer provides the economic foundation for essentially everyone. In such towns, the relationship between the employer and the employees is never purely transactional, never simply an exchange of labor for wages. It is something more total. The employer is also the landlord, sometimes literally. The employer is the provider of the town's basic services. The employer's decisions about wages, about employment levels, about the continuation of operations, about the allocation of resources, these decisions determine whether the community survives. In a company town, challenging the employer is not like challenging your boss. It is like challenging the person who owns the floor you stand on and the air you breathe. The risks of resistance are not professional. They are existential. You do not just lose your job. You lose your house, your neighbor's house, the school your children attend, the hospital that serves your family. You lose the economic foundation that makes the community function. Burns does not need to threaten any of this explicitly. He does not need to send representatives to town meetings to remind people what they stand to lose. Everyone who lives in Springfield already knows. The knowledge is in the air. The knowledge is transmitted through every business relationship and social interaction that touches the plant's economic orbit, which is to say every business relationship and social interaction in town. The fog that the radiation theory attributes to neurological damage, the denial that the principal and the pauper theory attributes to collective social choice, the economic theory says these are also produced, at least in part, by a perfectly rational calculation. The people of Springfield are not just cognitively impaired, they are economically trapped. Even if the radiation cleared tomorrow and every resident of Springfield suddenly achieved full cognitive function and complete clarity about what Burns has done and is doing, many of them would still not resist, because they cannot afford to, because the cost of the plant failing, of Burns's empire collapsing, of the economic foundation of the town being removed, is a cost that falls hardest on the people least equipped to absorb it. Burns has not just captured Springfield's biology, he has captured its economy. And the capture of the economy is, in the real world as in Springfield, often enough by itself to prevent the kind of organized resistance that could actually threaten an entrenched power structure. The radiation theory and the economic theory are not alternatives. They are collaborators. They work together. The radiation suppresses the cognition needed to see the economic trap clearly. The economic trap prevents action even from the people whose cognition is intact enough to see it. And Burns sits above both, sustained by his weekly treatments, managing his portfolio, sending Smithers to confirm his afternoon appointments. The system is complete. The loop is closed. Springfield will keep paying the bill. There is one last thing to say, and it is the thing that every theory in this video has been approaching without quite arriving at. The Simpsons is 36 years old. It has been on the air longer than most countries have had their current governments. It has been on the air longer than the internet has been publicly accessible. It has outlasted every other animated sitcom, every other scripted primetime show, every other American television institution that was running when it began. And in all that time, it has told one story, the same story, in 788 variations, with thousands of characters and dozens of settings, and an apparently unlimited supply of catastrophes and recoveries and resets. One story. A family tries to stay together. That is it. That is the whole thing. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, in a house on a street in a town that cannot be found, in a loop that cannot be broken, trying in their various ways to stay connected to each other across the noise and chaos and distraction that Springfield continuously generates. They fail constantly. They hurt each other. They let each other down. Homer says the wrong thing and Marge pulls away, and Bart does something that embarrasses the family, and Lisa feels unseen, and Maggie observes all of it from behind her pacifier with eyes that have been watching since 1989. They fail, and they come back, and they fail again, and they come back again. The loop is not a prison. The loop is the story. Every family that has ever existed has had this loop. The specific details differ. The house is different. The city is different, the catastrophes are different, the year is different, but the fundamental shape is the same. Trying and failing and trying again, coming back, being there when it matters and sometimes not being there when it matters and having to live with both. Loving people imperfectly because love is always imperfect, because perfect love would not require 36 seasons to examine. That is why we watch. Not because Springfield is comfortable, or because the theories are satisfying, or because the predictions are uncanny. Because the family is true. Because Homer's love for his family is true even when Homer is foolish and selfish and wrong. Because Marge's devotion is true even when the show does not give it the credit it deserves. Because Bart's need for his father is true even when it looks like misbehavior. Because Lisa's loneliness is true even when it looks like arrogance. Because Maggie's watching is true even when it looks like absence. The loop exists because families do not resolve. They do not reach a conclusion and stop. They continue, season after season, year after year, failing and recovering and failing again. The same people in the same house with the same love and the same limitations, and the story keeps going because the story has not found a way to end that would not also end them. That is the final theory, the one underneath all the others. The one that explains why the show runs and why we watch, and why Springfield cannot be found on any map, and why nobody ages, and why Homer always makes it home. The story is still going because the family is still together. And as long as they are, we will keep watching. Wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is, however tired you are, the lights are on in Springfield. The family is home. Sleep well.